Hi. For those of you at Zoom, feel free. It's 2:01. We're on schedule, which is always good. My name is Abby Suckle. I am President of Culture Now and Vice President of the Lower Manhattan Historical Association. This is, as you know, the 400th anniversary of New York City history. It actually isn't really the 400th. The year was set up by, people have asked us, what about happened in the 1624, maybe 1626. It's true. However, there was a mayor at least 100 years ago who decided our city seal needed to have 1625 on it. So that is what we're going with. And we're also getting funding from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, so we feel that we should be in the right spirit. This is also, we like to think this is the first event of America's 250th. We're doing it in the 249th year because America began in New York. So this weekend is called It Happened Here. The reason is because over 1,000 things of global, local, and national significance took place in New York City. Particularly Lower Manhattan. If you wander around Lower Manhattan, what you are going to notice is it doesn't really look old. In fact, Lower Manhattan, it doesn't look old at all. And it's very difficult to realize that the city was older, or at least as old as Philadelphia and Boston, which really do look old. Part of this is how we think about real estate in New York, and part of this is how the city has changed, because New York has always been changing. So we thought for our 5 days, what we would do is have every day represent a century. Now, it turns out that nobody has the gravitas to listen to 1,000 events told beautifully by us for 5 days and still be breathing and standing at the end of it. So we have a lot of events on our app called, Culture Now's Museum Without Walls app, and we can, in much more depth, you can listen to, I think there's 2,500 podcasts and about tons of historical maps that kind of knit New York City's history into the bigger world and showcase a lot more information. What we've done is we've taken some highlights of each century, and that's sort of what this afternoon is about. Since yesterday, for those of you who possibly missed the fireworks, we heard 500,000 people didn't, was July 4th. Today is the 5th, and it's not only the morning after, but it's also when New York City grew tremendously from about 50 or 60,000 people, mostly downtown, to 3.5 million people in 5 boroughs. It roughly 1898 is what happened. So the highlighting events, which is what we're going to talk about today, is when Lafayette comes, because this is really in 1825, he's the only living general still from the Revolutionary War, and he comes back and he makes the world a grand tour for a year and a half, travels to all 24 states. And essentially that was sort of the first big post-revolutionary party that the country had. And then the Gilded Age, which essentially kind of exemplifies the coming of age of America in many ways. And in between, what we're going to talk about today is the immigration, because and what happened to get New York from a small town to a very large city, and how we thought about ourselves. And we're going to do this in 2 hours because we're very efficient. Okay, so first of all, please purchase t-shirts. We want you to go shopping outside. There's books, there's t-shirts, tote bags, and a wealth of things to spend whatever's left of your hard-earned cash on. Also, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's Mike Duncan. He's one of the foremost history podcasters in the world. His award-winning series, The History of Rome, set the standard for episodic narrative history and inspired a generation of listeners. His current series, Revolutions, explores the great political revolutions that have shaped the course of the modern world. He's the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Storm Before the Storm, The Beginning and the End of the Roman Republic, and hero of two worlds, the Marquise de Lafayette and the Age of Revolution, which you can buy outside. So with that, Mike, take it away.
There's gonna be a picture of my face up there. Okay, I'm here and I'm also up there. Oh, and before you spend your money on the t-shirts, though, yeah, get to the books first, and then whatever's left over is the t-shirts. First, the books, though. So thank you very much for coming out today. Thanks very much for hosting me today. And we have, you're gonna, thank you. That's nicer. Because the other anniversary that's happening is the 400th anniversary of New York. It's the 250 of the American Revolution. And then it's also the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's grand tour through the United States in 1824 and 1825. So we are here to talk about that because he went on this long 1.5 year tour of the United States where he visited all 24 states. And honestly, like, one of the first and most interesting things about Lafayette is that he's a Frenchman. He's not an American, but he actually saw more of America and met more Americans and more types of Americans than most of the founding fathers. You know, they didn't get out to Missouri and Illinois, but Lafayette did, and they didn't go to, lower class places, but Lafayette did. And so Lafayette really emerges from this tour, and really over the course of his entire life, like being even more American than the most American people that were founding the country at the time. And then the other sort of little myth I like to dispel at this point is that it's often treated, this tour is often treated as a man who once was something, then went into retirement for 25 years. And now he's, we found him in obscurity and he's going on this one last tour. And then when he goes back to France, it's to return to, and then he's off to the Elysian fields where he just disappears. But really, the Lafayette who was touring the United States in 1824 and 1825 is an active French liberal politician. He was a member of the Chamber of Delegates. He had recently tried to stage an army mutiny to overthrow the conservative government of Louis XVIII. And one of the reasons he was coming to the United States is because things had gotten a little rough for Lafayette on account partly of this army mutiny. And then also because they suspected him of being a part of this, the government had targeted him to destroy his reelection chances in the subsequent election. So he lost reelection because the government targeted him. And then he gets this very nice letter from President James Monroe saying, "Hey, would you like to come to the United States for a while? We still love you." And he's like, "Yes, I think I would very much like to do that." And his traveling secretary, this guy Levasseur, who I'll be referencing a lot of the quotes that are coming from this, are from Levasseur, and he was also a member of this mutiny that had gone on. And Lafayette was like, "You want to come with me?" He's like, "Yeah, I would also like to get out of the country." That's fantastic. And then when he goes home after the tour, he does not go home to retirement. He goes home, he returns to being a member of the liberal opposition to the conservative government of then King Charles X, and is then embroiled in the Revolution of 1830. He's in his 70s at this point. And this is one of the things that I find most fascinating about Lafayette, and why I went from being like, "Oh, I like this guy, he was in the American Revolution and the French Revolution," to I want to write an entire book about this person, because that whole back third of his life is really undercovered in most biographies and most accounts of him, except for his journey through the United States. So let's take him through the United States. So he arrives here in New York in August of 1824. And me and all the American Friends of Lafayette were, yep. Friends of Lafayette, rise up, right? Right. So we were all here in New York last August for the kickoff tour. And now we're back, which, that's how long he was in the country, right? Because he was still here the following year. And so a newspaper account sums up his arrival. It says the distinguished friend of civil liberty is again on our shores after a long absence. He left us weak, unorganized, and tottering with infancy. He returns to us and finds our shores smiling with cultivation, our waters white with the sails of every nation, our cities enlarged, flourishing, and wealthy, in our free government, and whose establishment he himself suffered. Perfect in beauty, union, and experience, he saw once again. So it is great to be back. And when he arrives, people in New York go crazy. He's one of the most famous living, living emblems of the American Revolution. He's the last surviving major general of the Continental Army. And so it is a huge thing. And they run him on a parade from up Broadway to City Hall, where he's greeted. And his traveling secretary, Levasseur, describes that all the streets were decorated with flags and drapery, and from all the windows, flowers and wreaths showered upon the general. So they were like chucking stuff out the window at him, which means this is basically the first ticker tape parade, like honest to God. And like that run has now been used like over and over again. And Lafayette was really the first one to enjoy it. And then when he gets up to City Hall, there's this huge banner greeting him. And the way that he is greeted is as the nation's guest. And kind of everywhere he goes throughout this tour, that's what he is. He's the nation's guest. And so everybody is welcoming him. And this is actually quite important because in 1824, when he arrives, if you know a little bit about American political history, this is really like one of the first great contested political elections in American history. You know, this is the end of the era of good feelings when the Democratic Republicans kind of like run everything as a one-party system. And we're getting into the battle between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. It was a four-way race, and people were absolutely at each other's throats through all of this. It was a very, very contentious election. And then Lafayette shows up, and everybody loves Lafayette. You cannot, you know, they don't have, you know, photographs at the time, but like you cannot miss your photo op with Lafayette. So everybody has to come and meet him. And so he's constantly jamming people who want to kill each other. And then they have to sit around a table together and toast him. Remember that they're all Americans. Remember that they have all inherited the same legacy. And remember that he wants the project to succeed. And if you want to please Lafayette, you know, maybe don't end things just because you're at each other's throats. And Levasseur wrote that about one of these dinners. When we landed in New York, the people of the United States were occupied by the choice of a new political chief. The newspapers, which the evening before were furiously combating their favorite candidates, now closed their long columns on all party disputes and only gave admission to the unanimous expression of public joy and national gratitude. At the public dinners, instead of caustic toasts intended to throw ridicule and odium upon some potent adversary, none heard but toast to the guests of the nation, around whom were amicably grouped the most violent of both parties. So he's a unifying figure through the end of an incredibly contentious election. And then what he's going to do is he's just going to start running around from city to city. He goes from New York up to Boston. He's greeted by governors, by mayors, by local notables. He goes and sees John Adams, who he had known, you know, from back in the American Revolution. Adams is now Adams was always cantankerous, but like he had achieved new transcendent levels of cantankerousness by 1824. But so him and Lafayette like have dinner, and then he meets with boosters of some people that are putting up a monument in Bunker Hill to celebrate what is going to be the 50th anniversary the next year. And they're like, hey, do you want to come around for that? And Lafayette had only really been planning on doing a couple months up and down the Eastern Seaboard. And he's like, yeah, you know, everywhere I go here, people love me. And, you know, Lafayette, he likes being loved by lots of people. This is something that he likes. And so he's like, yeah, for sure, I'll stick around. And they start rearranging their plans at that point to actually do like a full tour of everything. So they get back down into New York. And at this point, he is met by somebody who is often not talked about on any of sort of the official accounts of Lafayette's tour, but who was really important to him, is this woman named Fanny Wright, who was an activist and an abolitionist. And, you know, Lafayette's wife, Adrienne, had died in 1807, and this is 1824. And he had met Fanny Wright there. It's unclear what their ultimate relationship was, but they both loved America. They were both abolitionists, and she wanted to come along on the ride. And it was scandalous. You know, they weren't married, and she was coming along. But their idea of what America could and should be, like the promise of having a war for liberty, partly meant that slavery had to end in the United States. Lafayette was a staunch abolitionist. He had been a staunch abolitionist since, you know, at least as early as 1783. And this had been on his mind. Like, and when he goes through the tour, as we're about to see, like he is confronting, you know, whether or not the Americans are going to be able to pull this off. And Lafayette's conception of what the nation is, you know, everybody's welcoming him as the nation's guest, but to him, that was not just, you know, the white people in America. He was also very interested in the Black part of the population, who he thought was also a part of the nation because, you know what, they were. And so while they were in New York by September, he went and visited the African Free School, which was an early school that was dedicated to the education of African children, because in Lafayette's opinion, the only thing that differentiated sort of the status of the blacks and the whites in America, there was no inherent difference between blacks and whites. That idea like offended him on a deep level. He thought it came down to just like education and material circumstances. And so if you give everybody like a free and open opportunity to the same education, everybody's going to wind up at the top of that, basically the same. And so he was greeted by this young boy named James McCune Smith, who was 11 years old at the time. He says, "Here, sir, behold hundreds of poor children of Africa sharing with those of a lighter hue in the blessings of education. And while it will be our pleasure to remember the great deeds you have done for America, it will be our delight also to cherish the memory of General Lafayette as a friend to African emancipation and a member of this institution." And James McCune Smith goes on to be the first African American to get a medical degree. He had to go back to Europe to get one, and then he comes back. And then he becomes a prominent abolitionist and a mentor to Frederick Douglass. So those connections are made. And this is a kid who Lafayette met and, hopefully helped get to that point. And then they run up to Troy, New York after that. And as they're walking around and they're commenting on things, at New York at the time, slavery was going to be outlawed by 1827. And so this is like 1824. And they're like, yeah, this all makes sense. Like slavery's got to go. We all know that slavery's got to go. And Levasseur wrote that happily, like by 1827, liberty will no longer have to blush in the presence of a colored man. That's a little optimistic, but that's what they were hoping for. And then he also toured at up in Troy. A woman named Emma Willard had started the Troy Female Seminary because Lafayette was also, education to him was like a silver bullet type thing, that like any sort of differences that you see in the conditions of men or women or black or white, like education can overcome these things, and having freedom and material freedom can overcome these things. So he tries that, and then him and Emma Willard wind up hanging out a couple years later in Paris when she goes out there to visit. So then they run down. So then they're going to start plunging south. And he runs through New Jersey, where, of course, if you're in New Jersey, you stop by and you visit the brother of Napoleon Bonaparte, who has fled Europe and set up shop outside of Trenton. So there was a Bonaparte there who just winds up being some guy from New Jersey, and beloved there. And then so they're on their way to Philadelphia. And another bit about this tour is that everywhere Lafayette goes, there's a lot of people who, they weren't alive during the revolution. Those days are over. There's grown adults who were born after the revolution even started. So their conception of it is this thing from the past, not as something that they remember. And so when Lafayette's coming through Philadelphia, the old State House, what is now Liberty Hall, was dilapidated. It was falling apart. They weren't using it anymore because it had been a functional, government building and then fallen apart. But Lafayette's coming into town. Where are we going to host him? What should we do? And they raise money to rehabilitate the old State House and turn it into Independence Hall, which is what we know today as Independence Hall. And this is a period where we're starting to transform these sites from places of revolutionary lived memory into just the preservation of memory. And so where Lafayette goes, this is why they start naming stuff after him: Lafayette this, Lafayette that. That's why everything is named after Lafayette. But he's also, the Bunker Hill Monument. Like, he's there for this moment. He is a transitional figure between we remember the revolution and, oh, I guess we remember the revolution, right? Nobody actually does. And while they are in Philadelphia, first thing is they meet some guys in the Pennsylvania militia who tell them that if Andrew Jackson does not win the election, they're going to take up arms and overthrow the government, because they will be assured that the election was stolen, because they know that their man Jackson's the most popular person in America. And so if he loses, they're going to take up arms. And they were like, all right, well, that's okay. We'll come back to you, which we will. But also in Philadelphia, Fanny Wright and Lafayette ruffle the feathers of the local notables and the local elites, because, Lafayette is interested in African emancipation and African freedom. And Fanny Wright arranges for him to meet a representative of Free Haiti, the Free Republic of Haiti, which had recently liberated itself in a war for independence and a war against slavery. And it's the first and only time in human history that a group of slaves have actually risen up and overthrown their masters. Patrick Henry talks about slavery, being a slave to the British, but like, no, like, I'm sorry, your taxes were slightly too high, but like, that's not slavery, sir. The Haitians actually did it. And so he meets with this representative, but they had to sneak the guy in the back door so that he could do this. But then when Lafayette ends this meeting, he does not send him back out the back door. And Fanny writes, the general afterward purposefully conducted Jonathan Granville to the receiving room crowded with visitors, and then took a second affectionate leave of him, conducting him to the head of the stair in front of all. Like, Lafayette wanted it to be known that if you love me and you think that I'm the unifying figure of this new republic, I consider the Black part of this population an equal part of this population. So deal with it. Then they go into Washington, D.C., right, where they are greeted by President James Monroe, who's great. James Monroe is an underrated president. If you're ever in Fredericksburg, there is a great little museum to President James Monroe. And in the Lafayette family, James Monroe is beloved because you go back to the French Revolution in 1794. Lafayette's already been locked up in prison for a while, but his wife, Adrienne, is in France. She was arrested by the Committee of Public Safety. Her and all of her family were slated to be executed. Most of her family were executed in 1794. And the only reason Adrienne herself was not executed was because James Monroe and Gouverneur Morris, who were representatives of America in Paris at the time, went to the foreign ministry of the French Republic and said, look, if you kill Lafayette's wife, you're going to have trouble, right? You're going to have trouble with us. This is not an official communique. This is not the president writing anything. We're just saying, like, if you want America to either support you or at least remain neutral, do not kill Adrienne. And so the French did not, and that's why she lived. So Monroe saved Lafayette's wife's life, and his son is there too. George Lafayette is along for this ride. So the guy who saved his mother is Monroe. And then they go out to Mount Vernon from Washington, D.C., because obviously George Washington is the biggest figure in Lafayette's life, aside from his immediate family. That meeting Washington when he's this 19-year-old kid, kind of looking for a father figure, kind of looking for a mentor, and then having Washington really step into that role and himself embrace that role, for the rest of his life, Lafayette is always asking the question, like, what would George Washington do? And I think a lot of his conduct during the French Revolution is like, how would Washington handle this? How would Washington handle this? But he hadn't seen, Washington died in 1799, and he hadn't seen him in 40 years. And this is the first time he was able actually to go to the crypt where Washington is buried. And Levasseur writes that as we approached, the door was open, and Lafayette descended alone into the vault, and a few minutes after reappeared with his eyes overflowing with tears. He took his son and me by the hand and led us into the tomb, where he indicated the coffin of his paternal friend. And we knelt reverently near his coffin, which we respectfully saluted with our lips. Rising, we threw ourselves into the arms of Lafayette and mingled our tears with his. These are great figures, mythical figures in American history. But to these guys, this is dad to him. Lafayette's dad died when he was 2 years old. He never really had a father. And so for him to be able to be there and see this, like, it moved them profoundly. And then he bums around in Virginia, visiting all the famous places that you would visit today if you were bumming around Virginia looking for historical places to visit. Monticello, he's with Jefferson. He's with Madison for a bit. And again, these are guys, like, he had known Jefferson since the Virginia campaign in 1781. Like, Jefferson had been out in Paris during the French Revolution and, like, helped edit Lafayette's initial Declaration of the Rights of Man in July of 1789. And then over the years, like, after Lafayette gets out of prison, Jefferson had tried to get him to become the governor of the Louisiana Territory, because he's writing him and he's essentially saying, this is paraphrasing, but like, okay, I just got a bunch of French Catholics in the country and I don't know how to deal with them. If you could come be a French guy who can talk to French Catholics who just became a part of the country, that'd be great. But Lafayette passed on that offer because he wanted to stay in Europe, because Adrienne was not dead yet and he didn't want to leave her behind. And then they also offered him, like, a huge tract of land, like, and then this will be your income. But it was a slave plantation. And he actually did not want to, gain an income off of slave labor. And so there is it's funny in a way, but there's a letter in the archive back from Jefferson where Lafayette has said, I want the plantation that'd be great, but like, I don't want it run by slaves. And Jefferson is like, I don't know how to do that. I don't know what that means. So he never took the land. He never took the job. But so we are still in, the contentious political territory of 1824. It's December of 1824. And he's in Washington, D.C., and there are like joint sessions of Congress, which again, everybody who's at each other's throats over this election has to sit down and listen to stuff about Lafayette and what a unifying figure he was. And Henry Clay, who's one of the candidates in this election, gives this great speech where he's, the people of the United States have ever beheld you true to your old principles, ready to shed the last drop of blood, which here you freely and nobly spilt in the same holy cause. You are in the midst of posterity. Everywhere you must have been struck by everywhere you have been, you must have been struck by the great changes, physical and moral, which have occurred since you left us. But in one respect, you behold us unaltered, and that is in the sentiment of continued devotion to liberty, right? Because Lafayette is liberty, and liberty is Lafayette. Then in February of 1825, if you remember from your 8th grade social studies textbook, there is a thing called the corrupt bargain, where John Quincy Adams, the electors for Henry Clay go to John Quincy Adams. That gives the election to John Quincy Adams over Jackson, who had the most. Jackson had the most, but John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay combined to beat him in the Electoral College. And then John Quincy Adams immediately turns around and names Henry Clay Secretary of State, which was the second most important office at the time. And so they call this the corrupt bargain. And, it caused a lot of, dissension, and it caused a lot of, outcry. And they run into those militia guys that they had talked to earlier. And so Levasseur is like, they're at a party, and he's like, well, the great question is decided, and in a manner contrary to your hopes. What do you intend to do? How soon do you lay siege to the Capitol? And they said, you recollect our threats. We went in truth to great lengths, but our opponents disregarded and acted properly. So now it is settled, and all we have to do is obey. We will support Adams as zealously as if he were our own candidate, but at the same time, we'll keep a close watch on his administration, and according as it is good or bad, we will defend or attack. 4 years are soon past, and the consequences of one bad election are easily obviated. And that is how it's supposed to go in a republic. And it worked like this. Like, if you lose an election, you're not just supposed to like go into an insurrection. You're not supposed to storm the Capitol. You're not supposed to do these things. And thank goodness we have learned that lesson. Because nothing like that ever happens anymore. So at this point, though, Fanny Wright, who's been along for the ride this whole time, is getting increasingly annoyed at what she is seeing and hearing, because everywhere they go, it's like, Lafayette is the man of liberty. Lafayette is the man of liberty. We are the man of liberty. Well, like, we are the people of liberty. But she's also looking at slaveholders and slavery everywhere she goes. So she takes off and she writes, the enthusiasms, triumphs, and rejoices exhibited here before the countenance of the great and good Lafayette have no longer charms for me. They who sin against liberty of the country, against those great principles for which their honored guest poured on their soil his treasure and his blood, are not worthy to rejoice in his presence. My soul sickens in the midst of gaiety and turns almost with disgust from the fairest faces and the most amiable discourses, because she hears Henry Clay saying things like, you behold us unaltered, in our continued devotion to liberty. Well, if you're continually devoted to liberty, slavery is literally opposite of liberty. You can look it up in the dictionary. It says antonyms, and antonym of liberty is slavery, and antonym of slavery is liberty. So these two things cannot coexist, and yet you're continuing to pretend like they do. So she left. She was mad. Lafayette was sad. Nobody else was sad to see her go, though. So then they run down into Charleston, and so now they're heading into the Deep South. And this is a nice quote just to give you a flavor of like what it is like when Lafayette comes to town. Everybody shows up, everybody, because he is like the most famous person they have ever heard of or seen. And so everybody comes out, and Levasseur writes as they go into Charleston, the procession was soon increased by a great number of parties composed of the clergy, the Association of the Cincinnati, veterans of the Revolutionary Army, students of the different faculties, officers of the United States Army and Navy, judges of the different courts, children of the public schools, German, French, Jewish, and Hibernian, beneficent societies and associations of mechanics, et cetera, et cetera. That's in the quote. That's not me. All these detachments were distinguished by the form, color, and devices of their flags. So everybody turns out, everybody's welcome, everybody's great, except during this same period, we also have ordinances that were posted that when Lafayette is coming to town, no Black people are allowed to be inside the city limits. We don't want you around for any of this, which is contrary to Lafayette's own beliefs, but was not contrary to the beliefs of the Southern governments at the time. So as they head into the South, now they are really confronting slavery, not as an abstract idea, not as something that like, oh, there's a few slaves left, but you know, like they'll soon be gone. They're actually now down there. And Levasseur writes, and all of this is coming, I should mention, Levasseur writes this travel log, this 2-volume travel log that really, it's like part like social studies report about all the states. It is part travel log about what they're doing. And then it's also political commentary, because this is all meant to then be published back in France after they get back. And remember, Lafayette is still an active politician. So a lot of what is being written in this travelogue is meant to be read contemporaneously at the time as statements of his political principles and what he believes in and what he wants to happen. And so Levasseur writes about the slavery that they are now encountering. When we have examined the truly great and liberal institutions of the United States with some affection, or with some attention, sorry, the soul feels suddenly chilled and the imagination alarmed at learning that at many points of this vast republic, the horrific principle of slavery still reigns with all its sad and monstrous consequences. Lafayette believed that everyone was born free and equal. You know, he was an aristocrat and he had been told his entire life, you are special. You are better than all of these other people. You have different blood. You have a different mind. You're better than everybody. And Lafayette, you know, for all of his riches and all of his, you know, he is a noble, you know, he was raised in that tradition. He never bought any of that. It really does not seem like he ever bought any of that. And when he went to Versailles as a young man, when he was a teenager, you know, he's hanging around with like the guy who becomes Louis XVI before he's even king. He's with Marie Antoinette in their social circle before she's Queen Marie Antoinette. And he was looking at these Versailles teenagers and like, this is really the inner circle of like the French nobility. This is who's running things. These people are supposed to be better than everyone else. And he's not very impressed with them. And then he winds up, you know, he runs away from home and joins the Continental Army because he doesn't like living in Versailles. And he winds up meeting people like Alexander Hamilton and, you know, Henry Knox and guys who were just talented people who tried to do things. And he's like, these guys are better and more capable having come from nothing than these people who were back at Versailles, who were given everything in the world. So, you know, by the time he's 20 years old, Lafayette doesn't buy hereditary superiority at all in any sense of the word. And so, I'm sorry, I lost my place here. Oh, so as they go down, and as I said earlier, you know, he thinks that any difference that you see between like enslaved people or even free blacks in the United States at the time and the white part of the population come down entirely to their level of education and how much property they are allowed to own. Like if you have some money and you have an education, there's absolutely no reason why the black part of the population cannot be completely equal with the white part of the population. And Levasseur says at this point that in this part of the United States, the prejudices against the blacks, it must be confessed, keep a great number of slave owners blindfolded. It is in vain that some individuals, blinded by their prejudices, exclaim that there is no hope of improving the African race, which is only intermediate between man and brute in the scale of being. Numerous facts have long since refuted this absurd assertion, and moreover, may it not be asked of those who are proud of the whiteness of their skin and who judge the blacks only by what they are, not by what they are capable of, if they know well that what their condition would be if their descendants, after several generations, were enslaved and that slavery was suddenly transferred from the blacks to the whites. Because that point is basically like, I can get white people looking just like the slaves do right now if we do not educate them or give them any money for like 3 generations. So this is part of what he thinks is going to rejuvenate the United States and end slavery, which at every step of this Lafayette thinks is going to happen. He thinks that the Constitution is going to eventually abolish slavery. He thinks that the Americans are going to eventually abolish slavery. I think he's naive on this point because I think it was more entrenched than he ever wanted to believe. And then it does take a war. And we don't get, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment until the Confederacy is defeated. And like only the Union guys are voting on these new amendments. If it had been the unified United States at the time and when those amendments are being passed, I don't think they would have passed, because even then it was against the sort of the settled principles of a lot of Americans in a way that Lafayette never really saw, because he didn't want to, because he believed in America. And so there is redemptive power, but also he's a little naive. And then also, during this period, he is an abolitionist, but he's also like, he's the nation's guest, and he does not really want to ruffle too many feathers. So it's not like he's giving speeches, saying we must end slavery, but he is privately in all of these homes when he meets with slave owners, he is bringing it up. And Levasseur says that at Montpelier, that Lafayette broached amongst the friends of Mr. Madison the question of slavery. It was approached and discussed by them frankly. And it appears to me that slavery cannot exist a long time in Virginia, because all enlightened men condemn the principle of it. And when public opinion condemns the principle, its consequences cannot long subsist, which is a very nice thought, isn't it? Oh, something is bad, we'll end it. Yeah, that's certainly what humans have done throughout history. It sometimes happens, and often does happen. We wouldn't be here today living a better life than they were living 200 years ago if that was not sometimes true. But the fact that everybody was able, all these slave owners were able to say behind closed doors, yes, it's terrible. Yes, we don't want it. And yes, it's going to go away, which many of them believe. Like a lot of those guys did believe that slavery was on its way out, and it was the cotton gin that really like revs the whole thing back up again. But when they went back out, they were like, yeah, but not yet. Right. And that not yet lasts every single day until the Civil War. And then they go down into Georgia. And in Georgia, they meet kind of the other great shadow and stain on American history, which is like Indian removal and the genocide against the native peoples who were living in all of these places. And when they're down in Georgia, they are meeting with the Creek, or the Muskogee Nation, who have recently signed a deal to be self-evicted from their own homes in 1827. And so they're sort of living in the last, they're traveling through the last days of like Creek, Georgia, and all these people are about to have to be removed. And Lafayette has always had good relations with Native American peoples. And it goes all the way back to his time in the Continental Army, because the native peoples always had a very combative relationship with the white settlers, right, of the Americans, because the Americans were always taking their land. But the French, who were up in Canada and around the north, and who were just sort of traveling around, most of them were like trappers and traders. They would intermarry, they would sort of join tribes a lot of the time. It was not this sort of like project of settler colonialism. And so they got the Continental Army has a French guy now. And like a French guy can go talk to, for example, the Iroquois, and they might listen to a French guy in a way that they might not listen to like an American representative. And he does, and Lafayette has this relation with the Iroquois. He's adopted into one of the tribes. He takes a couple of kids back to France to educate them, so then they can come back to America and represent their people. But through this, Lafayette is saying to them the line of like, the American, like, don't hate the Americans so much. Like, they do love liberty, they do love freedom. They're not your enemy, and you should live in harmony with them. And then, I obviously am very sympathetic to Lafayette. I like him a lot. But at this point, what he's saying to them, he believes. He's not lying to them. It's not like he's going out there and cynically trying to convince them of something. But if you're telling the Iroquois in the late 18th century, don't worry, the Americans are fine, that's not really true. And then he is down in Georgia, and he's kind of doing the same thing here, where he's telling them, okay, like, this is bad, and there's obviously conflict over this, and you're being expelled from your homes, but ultimately you should work to live in harmony with the white part of the population. And then I will definitely talk to the white part of the population about living in harmony with you, which he also did. He wanted everybody to get along. But sort of the trail that he is leaving through this is like, it's okay, it'll be okay, the Americans are okay. And then, obviously really not. But they're writing in here, their observations of what it was like. And Levasseur is looking around at like the treatment of these people. And he writes in this that they came across a village that was almost entirely inhabited by persons who, in the love of gain, had assembled from our parts of the globe to turn to their own profit, the simplicity, and above which the new wants of their unfortunate natives. These avarice wretches who, without scruple, poison the tribes with intoxicating liquors and afterwards ruin them by duplicity and overreaching, are the most cruel and dangerous enemies of the Indian nations, whom at the same time they are accused of being idlers and drunkards, which is not what they were encountering at the time. So then they roll off to New Orleans. New Orleans is great, right? He's a French guy in New Orleans, so they have a great time. But again, Lafayette is always wanting to sort of visibly and publicly demonstrate that he does not want anyone excluded from this idea of the American nation. And so when they're in New Orleans, there are companies of soldiers who fought in the War of 1812. And there was a black regiment that had fought in the War of 1812, and they were there publicly. And Lafayette made a point of going down the line in New Orleans in 1825 and shaking the hand of every single one of those black soldiers. And then Levasseur writes about this, that, oh no, Lafayette makes a speech where he says, I have often during the War of Independence seen African bloodshed with honor in our ranks and for the cause of the United States, which black soldiers had always served in the Continental Army. They had also served in the British Army during the War of Independence. But black Americans have always been a part of every constituent part of the United States going back to the very beginning. And Lafayette wanted to remind everyone of that at all times. So now, though, New Orleans, so they're going to run up the Mississippi River. Now, dude, they are out in the sticks. They are in the middle of basically nowhere. Nobody of Lafayette's stature has ever come through town. And he just runs through these little villages, these little hamlets. Like, I mean, St. Louis is barely even a thing. And so, but everywhere he goes, he continues to like, oh my God, this guy is here. And this is him again, like really seeing more of the United States than anybody had ever seen. He's gone from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Mississippi and met everyone in between, because if he comes through, people are like literally lining the road. On their way up, oh no, the next thing is when they get to the Illinois territory, we again find like this little, like sort of these wrinkles in American history that people keep trying to smooth out. One of which is that when we talk about slavery sort of before the Civil War and around the era of the founders, one of the notions is, okay, well, everybody was doing it. Everybody like knew it was a thing. They knew it was bad, but like they didn't want to, like they just couldn't see a way out of it. And when they get out to Illinois, they meet the recently elected governor of the Illinois territory, who was a guy called Edward Coles, who had been a Virginia plantation owner and had owned slaves and had a bunch of slaves. And he wanted to free his slaves. He wanted to emancipate his slaves. And, you know, one of the arguments for slavery is like at the time was, okay, well, property rights are inviolable. You know, if somebody has property, that's like the benchmark of liberty, is the protection of private property. You can do with and dispose of your private property as you would see fit, right? Until guys like Edward Coles are like, I want to free my property. I don't want them to be my property anymore. And then Virginia's like, oh no, you can't do that, right? We can't. It's against the law now to free your slaves or to free them en masse, right? You can do a few here and there token stuff, but they absolutely did not want any kind of like momentum getting going on freeing slaves. So what Coles did is he packed up everyone. They moved out to Illinois and he said, you're free. Great. So that's how that worked. And people like Coles existed the entire time. You know, there were always people arguing against slavery. There were always people saying slavery is wrong. It is not the case that everybody was on board with it. John Dickinson, one of the best and most famous of all the founding fathers, who has subsequently been written out of the history books a little bit and made a bad guy in the John Adams miniseries, which I'll probably solve that at some point, maybe in a Dickinson book. He was against independence, so that's the thing. But like, I mean, what are you going to do? Take on the whole British Army? Like, we're not going to win that. And then Dickinson also had slaves and he freed them, and that complicates the narrative of, hey, if you were a slave owning founding father, what else were you going to do? Because there is proof that there were other ways. So then they run up, they get on the Ohio River, and they're on a riverboat, and they're heading into Ohio, and the thing runs into a sandbar and starts sinking middle of the night. Like this thing just like, and suddenly everybody's got to like get off the boat. Lafayette's old. He's, you know, they gotta like lift him out of the thing, put him in a boat, get him on the shore. Like everybody's fine. Everybody's safe. It happens slow. And one of the things that Levasseur says, like in the travel log, is, okay, we lost like 2/3 of our correspondence, right? Because people are sending him letters like all the time. And he was like, and I'm not that broken up about it. Because he was having to sit and like answer letters like just round the clock, like 18 hours a day. And he's like, oh, whoops, email bounced. Sorry, man, I cannot respond. So then they're running around the West. They're out in Tennessee. They meet with Andrew Jackson. And like, so he's having met with Andrew Jackson, and then back when they were in DC before for the election, Martin Van Buren was a senator from New York and a staunch Jacksonian, and he was in DC at the time. And William Henry Harrison was an elector for Henry Clay. So we know that he was in Washington, DC at the same time. And all these parties, all the notables are there. So I think it's almost certainly true that Lafayette would have met both of those guys, which means that he met and knew personally the first 9 presidents of the United States. Increasingly, like, I'm not personal friends with Martin Van Buren, but he probably shook his hand, which, again, Lafayette is in some ways like has more Americanness like emanating out of him than any of the others do. So then they run up to, one of the points of, what America is a lot of the times, like in our popular imagination, it is a place of great natural wonder and natural beauty. I mean, North America rules, like in terms of natural beauty, but people come here to look at the amazing things that we have. And then it's also like, we're kind of an ingenious culture. We can build things up. We can make amazing stuff. And so they get up to Niagara Falls, which, number one, that's amazing. They don't got the Niagara Falls back in Europe. You got nothing like that back there. So they see that, and this is the wondrous beauty. And then that's the beginning of what is going to be the Erie Canal, which had just been built. It had not actually been opened publicly yet, but it was about to be. And he's Lafayette and his barge. They're like, okay, well, we'll let you do it. Like, we'll let you pass the line and put you on a boat and run you down the Erie Canal. And so he's like really one of the first people to make that run, which is, again, like Niagara Falls, Erie Canal, like somewhere between those two things really captures a lot of what America is about. And he makes it back to Boston just in time for the dedication of the Bunker Hill Monument, which is what he had said he would come back for, and they did make it in time. And he's there to dedicate that. And then ultimately, like, he doesn't pick it up at the time, but later writes back and gets dirt from the Bunker Hill like excavation site, which he then has imported back to France. And that is the ground under which he is buried in Picpus Cemetery in Paris. And so if you ever go to Paris, there is a cemetery. It's like €1 to get in if somebody is manning the door, which is not a guaranteed thing. You might have to knock. They might be taking a nap. They're the French, but they will ultimately let you in. Don't be like scared off if you ever want to go visit Lafayette's grave. And it's a nice little place. And yeah, the Bunker Hill soil is there. So now he's running short on time. He's going to have to get back, but he's doing the thing that we all do, which is like, how many states have you visited? How many states have you visited? And he's like, well, I want to collect them all. So he goes on this like quick run through like New Hampshire and Vermont. He's only there for like 3 days, but really just so he can be like, check. Like, I was driving around with my son a couple years ago, and we went to a Cincinnati Reds game. And like the river, like Kentucky's right across the river. And so I'm like, dude, we're going to walk across this bridge to Kentucky. And he's like, oh, I don't want to walk across a bridge to Kentucky. And I'm like, dude, you'll thank me later, because now you will have Kentucky on your list. And I know that's not important to you now, but at some point you'll be in a dorm room and people will be like, oh, how many states have you been to? And like, he'll have a good high number. I'm just trying to set him up for success. I'm cool. He was, there's a line on the bridge that says like, you are now in Kentucky. So, and then that's where we stopped. Like, he was like, we did it. We went over the line. I'm not going any further. He was tired. He's a good kid. That's not in these notes. So then he is back in, where does he spend July 4th, 1825, literally 200 years ago, right? Right here in New York City. So that's, yeah, great. So just yesterday, we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of that. And at that 4th of July celebration, which again, he's still just like everywhere he goes is just like huge parties turn out for him. And it's great that Lafayette is back. And this kid later writes, I remember I was taken up by Lafayette in his arms and held a moment. I remember that he pressed my cheek with a kiss as he sat me down, the childish wonder and nonchalance during the whole affair at the time, contrasting with the indescribable preciousness of the reminiscence sense. And who was that? Walt Whitman. Correct. Is it true? I mean, Whitman was a poet, but you know, as long as I say, was it true, I can include the bit about Walt Whitman because it certainly was. I mean, it was certainly being passed around. And like, obviously, like even way later in his life, like Walt Whitman is like, you know, still is wanting to be associated with Lafayette. So I told you that. So now he's back. Now he's back in the environs of Washington, D.C. And he's going to go see like all of his old friends like one last time. And again, like Jefferson is down there. Jefferson's an old man now. Jefferson's 2 years away from dying. And they'd known each other for 40 years. They'd been through a ton together. They'd closely collaborated. He'd known Madison since 1783 when he came back for a trip to the United States, and they had traveled up actually to meet with the Iroquois. He was a part of an embassy going up there. And then also James Monroe, who is also like the other guy in the list of Virginia presidents, but again, has a very close personal connection to Lafayette and is underrated as a president, I think, too. I don't know why I'm boosting James Monroe right now. Probably because he saved Audrey-Anne's life, and I like him for that. And then finally, it winds up in September of 1825 because Lafayette's birthday is September the 6th. And they talked him into having like a birthday celebration, like in and around the White House. I don't think we'll be doing a 200th anniversary of the thing in this White House. Yeah, I don't think we are. John Quincy Adams raises a toast, and he gives the final. And this is the final toast, and then we'll get out on this. Quincy Adams says, "When it comes to the contest of freedom, to which you have repaired a voluntary champion, had closed by the complete triumph of her cause in this country of your adoption, you return to fulfill the duties of the philanthropist and patriot in the land of your nativity. They are in a consistent and dedicated career of 40 years that you have maintained through every vicissitude of alternating success and disappointment, the same glorious cause to which the final years of your active life have been devoted, the improvement of the moral and political condition of mankind. For if in after days a Frenchman shall be called to indicate the character of his nation by that one individual, during the age in which we live, the blood of lofty patriotism shall mantle in his cheek, fiery conscious virtue shall sparkle in his eye, and he shall be pronounced with the name of Lafayette. We too, and our children in life and after death, shall claim you as our own." Which we do. We're here right now, continuing to claim Lafayette as our own, right? I just said like half a dozen times, Lafayette's more American than Americans are. And that's never going to stop. That will never stop. For as long as there is an America, as long as America is a thing, we will be talking about and celebrating Lafayette. So I will see you here back. I'll see you back here at the Francis Tavern in 2125. Once we get the life extension juice going, to celebrate Lafayette's 300th anniversary of his tour of the United States. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out. And so we're doing, how are we doing questions?
Yep, we're going to kick off the Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, please let me know, and I'll get to as many people as I can.
So when is the life of Lafayette going to become an HBO series?
Okay.
How many episodes, and who's going to play Lafayette?
Okay, it's 5 seasons, but it's streaming. So they'll say you get 5 seasons. They'll give me 1. Then I'll get halfway through the second one. They'll be like, we're canceling you. And then I'll have to tell the whole story in the final 6 episodes. And then everybody's going to yell at me because like it was compressed and too fast. Like, yeah, it's not my fault. Right. So I've got a pilot script. I wrote it, and but they're not buying it at the moment because it's just they are such fools. Yeah, if they just had a little creative vision, we would be able to do it. But they were like 12 episodes, and definitely was we were chasing Timothy Chalamet for a while. He's like, what else are you gonna do but get Chalamet? Because he's a quirky little French boy, and like Lafayette was a quirky little French boy. Except like he never got back to us. Because he's like making Dune and being like the most famous actor on the planet. But Chalamet is who I would actually want to do it. Yeah, for sure. I had an answer for that. Who else?
Lafayette was such a unifying figure in America, not in France. And to what extent do you think is that because he was kind of absent for the end of the era of good feelings and like the real emergence of partisan politics. And was he aware that that was sort of why he was still kind of the unifying figure?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. There is actually a moment after he gets out of prison where he is actively thinking about, or what he wants to do is move to the United States. Like when he flees from the French Revolution, like his plan is to get the family together and then they were going to book it to the United States where they would all live peacefully and happily. And then even after he's out of prison, they are talking about it. And Washington and Hamilton are both really reticent about this notion of Lafayette coming back because they were trying to stay neutral in the war. Lafayette was still on the proscribed list, right? Like it would have caused like diplomatic problems with France. And so they didn't want him to come. And one of the points that Hamilton made was, you know, it's really contentious here. Like I hate Jefferson. Jefferson hates me. You're friends with both of us. Like, and if you come here, you're probably going to have to choose one side or the other. And whatever side you wind up on, the other side is going to hate you. And so if you value exactly what you're talking about, which is like sort of the universality of love for you and your universality of feeling towards the Americans, because Lafayette didn't want to pick sides. He understood that there were political conflicts, but he really thought that all the Americans were one and together on this thing. And so he doesn't come back at that point, but I think that they were aware. And I think that does play a part in it. Like if he had come back earlier, he would have been drafted onto one side or the other, or in fine Lafayette faction, as he did back in the French Revolution, hated by both sides.
What was his relationship with Andrew Jackson, who was an actual politician when he got back in 1824?
Well, I mean, he never had the same relationship with Jackson that he did with like the presidents who were around or the figures who were around during the founding era. But like he met Jackson in DC and then they spent, I don't remember exactly how many days, but they were out in Tennessee and Jackson hosted them for like a little period of time there. And then they, exchanged correspondence. Jackson gave him a pair of pistols that had once been George Washington's. And I think that's about the extent of it. And then Lafayette heads home and Jackson becomes president. Like Jackson and Lafayette talking about it. That doesn't come up in anything I've read. Obviously, Jackson's going to go do the thing down in Georgia where they just were.
Thank you again for coming. Big fan.
Thank you.
Every other time you've come, just been out of town.
Well, I'll just keep coming. It's fine.
Thank you.
Yeah.
1776, Hamilton, or some third revolutionary musical I've never heard of.
Hamilton.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I have to say Hamilton because like I think Lin-Manuel Miranda got a 0 added to my advance because he made Lafayette famous. So because I wrote a whole book proposal that was like, here's why Lafayette is important. Like, here's all the things that he did. Here's why he's relevant to today. Like it's a great story. Please let me tell it. And I give it to him and they're like, are you talking about the French guy from Hamilton? And I'm like, yes, I am talking about the French guy. Because this is 2017. This is like heyday of Hamilton mania. And they're like, yeah, man, go write a biography of the French guy from Hamilton. But 1776 was the first one I saw. And I do have a lot of love for 1776. Yeah. Well, yeah, yeah, we'll fix that too. I'm gonna do a whole rehab tour for Dickinson. Dickinson's great. Like Dickinson was the only guy at all 5 of the big ones. He was at the Stamp Act Congress. He was at the Second Continental Congress. He was at the Constitutional Convention. What are the other 2? There was 2 more. I forget what they are, but he was the only one at all 5, and he's a great dude. Yeah, and he wasn't, unreasonable to make the point that we probably shouldn't take on the entire British Empire. Yeah.
So first, I want to thank you for writing this book. I guess you already know that this is the only book that's only Lafayette biography that's translated into Chinese.
That might be true. Yeah.
Yeah, that is.
That is true. Okay.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah, I signed that contract one time too. That was nice.
Okay, so
I get the books are so cool looking.
right?
I have one for The Storm Before the Storm too. Yeah.
There are a lot of people in China. They want to know Lafayette, and that's the book, the first book. That
Hell yeah.
yeah.
Great.
And my question is, so I'm trying to do some translation for the letters between Lafayette and Washington translated to Chinese.
Okay.
And I found there's like a lot of things, Washington's family returned all of their letters to Lafayette after Washington's death.
Okay.
And Lafayette did something that's very Lafayette, that he picked the pen, used some ink to change a lot of lines in it.
Mm-hmm.
When you were writing this book, did you find any thing from the letters that you found, well, this is definitely not what it was before, and you actually found or understand what it should be before?
You mean like, was there stuff removed from the letters that he crossed out?
Yes.
Yeah, because there were. And it wasn't him, it was his family after the fact, kind of went through and cleaned stuff up to make him look a little cleaner about what his legacy was at the time. Number one, there's a 6-volume collection of his letters and correspondence. And there's a bunch of letters through the French Revolution that he was writing to his mistress. And responses from her. Yeah, he had several mistresses along the way. He's a French aristocrat. Like, but what's funny is that like this is his mistress, and he's like having these letters that he's writing. They're all politics. It's like all political stuff. It's like, how romantic was this relationship actually? But yeah, so her name is just left off of every one of those letters. So they're published, but it's not clear who it's from. And then there's kind of famously, I guess, inside of Lafayette circles, I think Lloyd was probably there when you guys figured this out. But when Lafayette first came through the United States in 1777, when they landed in Charleston and then went up to Philadelphia, he was extolling the virtues of American republicanism and American Republicans he was writing back home. And among the things that he said is proof of American liberty is like, they've all got the same amount of land and everyone owns a Negro, right? Like, so everybody is equal here. And so he wrote that into the line. He's 19 years old. Now by this 1777, by 1783, he's writing letters back to Washington saying, and we're freeing the slaves now, right? So like he goes on a little journey with the slaves during the American War of Independence. But he does say this at the time. And there's the original manuscript, that line is in there and it's crossed out. And then in the published version of it, it's not included. It is now in the papers and you can see it. But yeah, they cleaned up. They cleaned it up because he believed in abolitionism later. And then, it was messy to have said that earlier. Oh God, Lloyd. Okay, great. Lloyd also wrote a biography of Lafayette. And this is when Lloyd asked me a really hard question.
So you have explained that Lafayette was an idealist about America, and when he was here in 1824-25, he was disappointed that slavery still existed and that Native Americans were unfairly treated.
Mm-hmm.
If he could land here 200 years later, still being an idealist, what do you think he would be most concerned about for his vision of America that has not come true?
Well, I mean, race relations still ain't there yet, like, yes, slavery has ended, but there are still material and educational and economic differences between the races in America that just continues to persist. But like, if he lands here now, like, there's really only one thing he's talking about. And that is the fact that there is a president who is like anathema to every single thing that they were fighting for. Like literally in the Federalist Papers, they are talking about this stuff, like stuff that is literally in the Declaration of Independence is going on right now. And so if Lafayette came around and looked at all this stuff, he's like, well, no, this is not it. Like, this is literally what we were trying to not do. So I think that more than anything else, he would be appalled at the government and opposed to the government. And, he's got a long track record of being against, especially like personalist authoritarian regimes, because like I said, like Washington was his model, and Washington wielded power and then set aside power later. Like, he was not just going to dive in and become like a permanent, lifelong dictator. So when Bonaparte shows up in France, Lafayette winds up opposing Bonaparte quite strenuously. Like everybody else, he's with him in the beginning. He seems like a liberal, enlightened guy. And then as Napoleon becomes increasingly authoritarian, that's when Lafayette turns on him and they have a falling out. And so that an opposition to authoritarianism is a deeply held principle of Lafayette. And so, yeah, I think you drop him in here now, and that would be mostly what he would be talking about and focused on.
One question from online.
Okay.
Has any research been done to trace what happened to the enslaved people who were sold when Lafayette's plantation in French Guiana was sold once his land was confiscated?
No, that's hard. So the deal is that Lafayette was such an abolitionist that in the mid 1780s he got in on a project to buy a plantation in Guyana and wound up owning, I think, 79 slaves total. And the idea was to give them an education, give them wages, forbid any of them from being sold, and corporal punishment, get the workers of the plantation the knowledge and experience and to be able to run it themselves, and then he would free those slaves and turn it over to them. This is a project that is like hotly opposed by all the other plantations in Guyana, so it's a hard thing to do. But he never gets around to freeing the slaves because the French Revolution comes along in 1789, and then it becomes sort of like an afterthought. And then when Lafayette is kicked out of the French Revolution and he's proscribed, the French government winds up taking back possession of that slave plantation, and they wind up owning it and owning those slaves. So there's at Cornell University in Ithaca, there are lists of the names and the slaves, and it went from like a really old blind guy down to like a 2-year-old, like the list of the names and stuff. I am not aware, maybe Lloyd, you are, I'm not aware of any further researchable documents that tell us like what happened to those people in the aftermath of that. They were re-enslaved for sure. They were re-enslaved under Napoleon for sure. Stinks.
Other questions? Just have time for a few more.
And what about the story of James Armistead Lafayette?
Great. Okay. What a softball. So James Armistead Lafayette was a slave who was down in Virginia during the Yorktown campaign, and who, as a slave who was attached to the British at Yorktown, was providing incredibly valuable intelligence to the Continental Army. Like in Lafayette, like one of the things they were doing was running spies the entire time. And like one of the things Lafayette was trying to do the whole time was like run spies. One of the first times he ever gets captured, he's supposed to be going off and finding spies, which is why when he almost gets caught on Barren Hill, he's in the tent late at night with a woman who he was definitely trying to make a spy for him. Yeah, that's definitely why that was going on. He was trying to recruit a spy. And then they had to run for it. But so James Armistead Lafayette, then after the war, he's still enslaved. Like he provided all this valuable service for the Continental Army, for the American cause, for the cause of liberty, and he's still enslaved. But he's petitioning for his freedom. And Lafayette does come back after the war one time in 1783 and is going down and like basically sees him, runs into him, and is like, "Oh, we know each other. It's you." And Lafayette is a hugely important figure even now as a legendary part of the American War of Independence. And Lafayette writes a sort of a letter on Armistead's behalf saying, "At least free this guy. Like, what are we even doing here? Like, he was invaluable. Like, please give him his freedom," which he did. And then Armistead takes up the name Lafayette as like a homage to that. And the descendants of James Armistead Lafayette are kicking around. They're here yesterday. They're great couple guys. Yeah, love those dudes.
First, thank you for the hours of content and everything.
No problem.
Appreciating all that
Sure.
over the years. My question is, in this present moment, as we've talked about a few seconds ago, in the role of history, I feel like there's always that element of great man history, and then there's the let's glorify men like Lafayette, glorify men like Washington. But now we're having a bit of a tension of like how that's taught here. I'm curious about Duncan & Co. and how that might play a role into, I feel like you're really focusing on historiography in that podcast, but where do you see how we teach history in America and broadly? Like, how do you see that evolving today, right now, in this present moment?
Well, in this present, like people ask me if I wrote a great man biography, right? Is Lafayette, like, is this a great man thing? And like great man theory is like everything that happens sort of like runs through like one guy, and it was their, the sheer force of will of a Napoleon or a Caesar or an Alexander the Great. Hamilton was good too, but sort of that's the theory of it. And at no point is Lafayette that person, right? Lafayette there are several times when history runs directly through Lafayette. I think it really happens with the Women's March on Versailles in 1789. He's very instrumental in how that winds up. He's also very instrumental in how the Revolution of 1830 turns out, right? Like, I think he was the one who was putting his thumb on the scale and it's going to go this way because this is what Lafayette wants. And then obviously because even if you take something like the alliance between the French and the United States, with of course Lafayette is an integral part of making that alliance happen. But at the same time, I do think if you take Lafayette out of the picture, France and the United States still had like state interests in being together, and that they probably would have reached some kind of agreement anyway, even absent Lafayette. So, and then at other times in history, he's just being buffeted about like the rest of us. He's a guy who's there, but history is so big that no one person can really like grab it by the reins and really hold it for very long. So people say, did you write a great man biography? And I say no, but what I do believe is that I wrote a good man biography. And it was one of the sort of the sub reasons why I wrote a book about Lafayette, in addition to the fact that, you know, he's the French guy from Hamilton, is because I have studied so much Roman history, and I have studied so much revolutionary history, and I have met some of the worst people who have ever lived, right? Like even the people like Caesar, like genocided half of France, you know, like these are not great people. You can judge them on a scale relative to like other political leaders, like who was better, who was worse. But on the scale of like human morality, like all these guys are like the worst bastards in history. Then I come across Lafayette, and he is somebody who sort of diligently and consistently all along the way is like a pretty good guy who's trying to make the world a better place than he found it. And he's generous with his time. He's generous with his money. His accountants are not very happy about that. Like there are great gripes from his accountants. Like, I am buried in receipts. You got to stop promising things to people. But he's a very generous philanthropist, and obviously and also courageous. Like, he's willing to like literally go out on the front lines, take shots, and risk his life to advance these causes. And I never really find him doing anything out of malicious intent. I never really find him doing things, oftentimes to his not advancing his own interests, when he's saying like, oh no, this would be too good for me, so I won't do it. Right. And then that winds up like hurting him politically, but he's a good guy. And so I do think that we can still talk about good men. Great men, like that's all out the window. Like, we're not really doing that anymore. It's pointless. But it is fun to sometimes talk about good men. Anyone else? Are we good? That it? We're good. All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. Stick around.
So I'm the first of several people who are going to try to follow that act. You probably won't be able to do that. It's a fabulous presentation here. My name's Ambrose Richardson. I'm the president of the Lower Manhattan Historical Association and a past president of the Sons of the Revolution. Both of these organizations have worked closely together. I consider the Lower Manhattan Historical Association sort of an outgrowth of what we do to keep history alive, the stories and lessons alive. And what the Lower Manhattan Historical Association is attempting to do here and in other instances is to say that we're not just about the American Revolution. I do want to mention here, as part of a transitional thing, as to how the Sons of the Revolution, which is about the 18th century, is relevant to the 19th century. And the reason is that the Sons of the Revolution were formed in the 19th century, informally in 1876, formally in 1883. And like other organizations, it was created because somebody couldn't get into another organization. Up to that point, the leading institution preserving American Revolutionary history was the Society of the Cincinnati, which even at the time it was formed was a little bit controversial as being aristocratic in a way that was un-American. The Society of the Cincinnati was for firstborn sons of continental officers who had served for 3 years or until the duration of the war. John Austin Stevens was a second son, so he didn't qualify this. It's sort of like the British hereditary thing, you know, the firstborn son inherits the estate, and the second-born son goes into the army. So this organization was the first of a number of historical and patriotic organizations that were formed in the late 19th century. This later spawned the Sons of the American Revolution, the Daughters of the American Revolution, colonial wars, the colonial dames, and so forth, which all came about at this time, which I guess is later going to be described as the Gilded Age. What I kind of like about the Sons of the Revolution is that it is for descendants of people who risked their lives for liberty and independence, but not just the officers, the continental officers. This includes militia, it includes privates, it includes all the people who starved and froze, got shot at, and got paid very little in many cases to go do that, which I think is really a wonderful thing to say, as Lafayette would have done. Hey, you know, we're all in this, we're all supporting this effort to achieve liberty and independence from Great Britain. Any one of the presentations today could be the only thing you would hear, and it'd be a fantastic thing. So let me transition to the next presentation by Rob Snyder, which is about immigration, by mentioning something that I discovered. You know, a lot of things you don't learn growing up in your history books. You ought to learn a lot of things later. I mean, we have an exhibit, new exhibit about the Birch trials, which is not just about the Birch trials, which happened here, but about the role of African Americans for both the British and the Americans. This is not something you learn about in your early history books. The other thing that was sort of struck me was that I was looking at the muster rolls of the Battle of Brandywine. And I'm saying, gee, there are a lot of guys from Ireland and Scotland and Germany and whatnot. Turns out of the Continental Army, about 40% were immigrants. So it wasn't just these guys, you know, the people out in the Massachusetts hills and whatnot, the Minutemen and whatnot. I mean, the Continental Army was in a way a typical army, young guys searching adventure, searching whatever they could get out of it. But these were the guys who put their lives on the line. And as I said, 40% of them were immigrants. Another 10 to 15% were African-American. By Yorktown, it was more like 25%. So they played a tremendous role at that stage. A lot of the Continental officers were immigrants. I mean, we have Horatio Gates, we have St. Clair, we have Lord Stirling and so forth. They're like, you know, a dozen generals who were foreign born. Of the Navy, John Paul Jones, Gustavus Cunningham, John Barry were born in Scotland or Ireland. So the American Revolution was the beginning of this amazing country, similar to this amazing city, which has been enriched by the talents and efforts of people from someplace else. As you know, we're all descendants of immigrants here for the most part. And let me introduce at this point New York's historian, Robert Snyder. His biography is in your program. I hope you have that. And let's get it going.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for that introduction. And it's great to see so many people out on an afternoon in New York City interested in the history of New York City and interested in events that take place here. New York was, from its very start, a city embedded in global trends and migration. It was, as Walt Whitman put it in the 19th century, a city of the world where all nations were represented. And surely the story of Lafayette is part of that, but it's also true that the story of many immigrants who arrived here penniless and seeking a new future is also part of that as well. New York, of course, begins not as New York, but as New Amsterdam, a company town for the Dutch West India Company, a seaport with a need for labor and a relative tolerance for religious and ethnic differences. And we're now 400 years since Dutch settlers started pasturing cattle in what we now think of as Lower Manhattan. And some people like to think of that as the founding episode in the history of New York City. And there's much to be said for that, because that's where city dwelling begins and then follows through all the way to our own time. But I think there actually is another period and another place where we might think about the beginning of New York City. And that's a short walk from here, the 5 Points, right off Foley Square, adjacent to the courthouse district in New York City. This, I'd argue, is where New York City, in a decisive way, becomes a city of immigrants, a city of a dynamic world economy, a city of conflict over what kind of city we will become in an era of immigration, a city of great wealth, but great poverty, and a city of great and extraordinary cultural creativity and fertility. What's fascinating to me is that so much of New York City's history is under our feet in Lower Manhattan, and we could walk from here to this spot, today's version of the 5 Points, in about 15 minutes, no more than that. As in so many other ways, the dynamic trends that shape and reshape New York City and would help create the 5 Points begin not just in New York, but with global developments in trade and economics. As you heard before, the Erie Canal opening in 1825 was a powerfully important episode in the creation of modern New York City. It solidified New York's status as the preeminent American port on the Atlantic. It made New York City the gateway for goods that would go up the Hudson River, across the Canal, and to the Great Lakes. And at the same time, from the Great Lakes, particularly wheat, east to the Hudson River, down to the port of New York, and made New York one of the great sources of trade in flour and agricultural goods. It's that canal episode that so much cements New York City's power and wealth in the first half of the 19th century. Also important is the creation of packet ships, sailing vessels that sailed on regular schedules between New York City and particularly the ports of Great Britain, above all Liverpool. Prior to 1818, merchant ships sailed when the captain had enough cargo. You could never guarantee when your vessel would arrive in Europe or Britain. You could never be sure that it would get there on time. So traffic was sluggish and ships had erratic holes. With the introduction of packet ship service in 1818, New York merchant ships are sailing back and forth on regular schedules, more passengers, more goods. New York's status as a port is strengthened and made even more vigorous. A great example of the landing of an immigrant ship is this etching from the 19th century of the landing of the ship Kossuth, which was a landing in New York City at Rutgers Slip with a boatload of immigrants from Europe. What's so striking about this image is the extraordinary array of human dramas packed into this picture. A pickpocket scores, lovers are reunited, a little boy exults, cargo is unloaded. The passengers of the Kossuth would have been quite glad to land in New York City because their ship had had a collision out on the Atlantic and was lucky to arrive intact when it got to New York. But what you must imagine is that this drama of the Kossuth was repeated many, 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 many times again as immigration began to swell into New York City in the 1820s, 1830s, and on into the 1860s. The statistic still strikes me as extraordinary. As late as 1835, New York City was a city of 207,000 people, 10% of whom were immigrants. It was a city with a strongly British and Dutch cast, it was overwhelmingly Protestant. By 1860, it is a city of 800,000 people, and 47% of them are immigrants. And those immigrants are primarily people who are coming here from Germany and Ireland by sail and immigrating here on ships like the Kossuth, and their arrival would transform New York City. The neighborhood of the 5 Points that they would settle in is located not far from here on the site of what was once called the Collect Pond. This was, down in the 18th century, a pond on the edge of the city, fed by a spring, and that spring sent clear water up into the pond, and the water flowed from that pond down into the Hudson River. British officers would picnic there. People would ice skate there in the first half of the 18th century. By the second half, though, this area has become industrial, and it has got breweries, it has got slaughterhouses, it is foul, it is filthy, and the water there is no longer clear to drink. The atmosphere is industrial. No one wants to live around there. No one wants to drink the water or picnic by it. So the city decides to fill it in. And by 1813, the land of the Collect Pond area is covered over. It's low and marshy ground, but it's earth. And and the surrounding hills have all been leveled and dumped into it. The neighborhood that emerges after construction there in less than 20 years is soon to become the most famous slum in North America. It's a rough neighborhood. It's a rowdy neighborhood. It's interracial. It's got African Americans living in it. It's got Irish Americans living in it. It's got German Americans living in it as well. There are a lot of brothels. There are a lot of dance halls. There's a lot of interracial sex going on there. When European visitors visit there, they are askance, but at the same time, they're compelled by it. They're fascinated by what's going on there because they sense, I think very correctly, that something really big is happening in this neighborhood. The neighborhood really gets, I think, an unfairly bad rap as a center for vice and crime. It was surely that. But like many poor neighborhoods in cities, it is a neighborhood that is both rough and respectable at the same time. And it's got both elements working in it. Let's start with the rough. Here's the old brewery, which is the 5 Points of myth in some ways. The grubby criminal 5 Points with lots of robbery, thievery, brothels, where domestic abuse was a common crime. The old brewery was built in the 18th century and it became a tenement in 1837. It was chopped up to multiple rooms inside it. Families lived in very crowded conditions. It was not healthy. It was not a safe place to live. It was viewed as dangerous. It was viewed as squalid by visitors. It was the kind of place you'd look at with a degree of a shudder. It was eventually purchased by the 5 Points Mission and torn down in 1852. You may have seen a version of this in Martin Scorsese's film Gangs of New York, in the opening scene where they go inside a big building which has a deep basement and all sorts of warrens of rooms upstairs. It's totally baloney. There were not deep basements in the 5 Points. The land was too marshy and swampy to do that. But the old brewery itself was a place that was a warren of many rooms before it was torn down. More respectable in many ways, and another side of the 5 Points that's important to understand if you want to think about this neighborhood as a whole is the Church of the Transfiguration. It's built in 1801 on Mulberry Street to be a church for English Lutherans. However, as the status of the neighborhood around the old Collect Pond begins to change, the Lutherans move on and the church becomes open for Roman Catholics, overwhelmingly Irish Catholics. And it's purchased in 1853 to house a Catholic congregation that's already existing in the neighborhood due to the Irish immigration that's transforming the city. The clergyman who heads this congregation is Father Felix Varela from Cuba, but he's got Irish parishioners. And it's churches like this that provide a welcome center for Irish immigrants coming into New York City in this period. It's in the church that they find the beginnings of social services that they need to settle in. It's in the church that they find some rest from lives of very hard labor that wear them down as they try to make a living in the 5 Points. It's a counterpoint, to be sure, to the brothels and the crime that also defines the neighborhood of this in these years. So I think it's really important to think of the 5 Points as a blend of rough and respectable, even in its most notorious years. Here's 5 Points rough. John Morrissey. John Morrissey was born in Ireland in 1831. He immigrated to New York City with his parents as a child. They settled in Troy, New York. He worked in factories and he ran with gangs. Eventually, he got a job working on a steamboat that took him down to New York City. The gangs that warred in New York City when Morrissey arrived were Irish Catholic gangs versus British Protestant gangs. The gang fights were a staple of New York City street life. They were also part of New York City politics. Political factions had gangs that controlled turf and controlled ballot boxes. So Morrissey shows up in New York City, and he first gets a job as a runner. In these years, when immigrants came to New York City, they did not go through an elaborate processing scheme. They were basically walking off ships, landing on the piers of Lower Manhattan in the East River primarily. Not until the 1850s did we begin processing immigrants in Castle Garden. So it was very rough and informal introduction to New York City. And when you got off the ship with your gear loaded into a duffel bag or a carpet bag, you would often be stopped by guys called runners who would offer to take you to a boarding house, to take you to a train station, to take you and your goods to some place that would get you on your journey for the rest of New York. Now, sometimes these runners were total shakedown artists. Sometimes they really did want to help you, but they never did it for free. They always wanted to be paid in exchange for that. So Morrissey starts out as a runner, a somewhat shady occupation on the waterfront in New York City in the 1840s. But he quickly graduates to that and becomes a bare knuckle boxer. Again, boxing is closely allied to gang life, and gang life is closely allied to politics. And Morrissey, in an early famous episode as a fighter, gets into a fight with an older guy. Some people say over the attentions of a woman. And Morrissey and the guy are fighting in a bar. They knock each other over. They knock over a pot-bellied stove, and Morrissey's back rolls through the hot coals on the stove. This creates smoke. The older guy coughs on the smoke. Morrissey gets to his feet and then wins the fight. Out of this, he gets the nickname Old Smoke. His rival in this world of gangs and bare knuckle boxing is a Protestant fighter named Butcher Bill Poole. Poole thrashes Morrissey in a dockside fight one day, and Morrissey's supporters seek out Poole after that, shoot him, mortally wounding him. His last words, "Goodbye, boys, I die a true American." Gambling was central to the world of prize fighting in Lower Manhattan. It's how prize fighters made their money. It's how people made their money. They laid down big bets. And Morrissey then graduates from fighting to gambling, and gambling on boxing to gambling on horse racing. And in Saratoga, New York, he becomes very involved in thoroughbred horse racing, particularly in the years during and after the Civil War. He also gets elected to Congress on a Tammany Hall ticket in 1866. So John Morrissey, in 20 years, has risen from being a gang member to the United States Congress. And he does that because in the world that he comes from, which is grounded in the 5 Points, Every political party has its own gang auxiliary. Every gang is politically connected, and moving from one to the other is not an entirely illogical and unreal thing to do. The other character that I want to introduce you to with regard to the rough and respectable end of the 5 points is the great dancer known as Master Juba. He was born William Henley Lane in Providence, Rhode Island, about 1825. He migrated to New York City, where there was an active dancing scene where both Irish American and African American dancers would hold dancing competitions on the docks. These ranged from informal sessions down on the docks to big competitions that were run in theaters. Dancers would appear opposite each other. They would challenge each other to do different steps. And there are plenty of accounts of this in the 19th century in the years of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And Master Juba is very much a part of it. He is a regular at Almack's, a dance hall on Orange Street that was later renamed Pete Williams Place. He was a featured dancer there, and he competed against a famous Irish American dancer named John Diamond. Charles Dickens saw Master Juba dance in one of the 5 Points dance halls in 1841, and he left this description of Juba's dancing. Single shuffle, double shuffle, cut and cross, snapping the fingers, rolling his eyes, turning in his knees, presenting the backs of his legs in front, spinning about on his toes and heels like nothing but the man's fingers on the tambourine, dancing with 2 left legs, 2 right legs, 2 wooden legs, 2 wire legs, 2 spring legs, all sorts of legs and no legs. What is this to him? Well, to Juba, it was the beginning of making a great living as a dancer. He became something of an international sensation. He moved to Great Britain, I'll say more about that later, and helped turn the 5 Points into a place that would be thought of as the birthplace of American tap dancing. So you've got 2 things coming out of the 5 Points that would shape American culture and politics going forward for many, many decades. One is that blending of Irish American and African American dance styles that creates tap, but also the birthplace of that machine politics that John Morrissey was part of, that John Morrissey excelled at, which was at once enfranchising for poor people, enfranchising for Irish immigrants, but also on the edge of criminal activity at the same time. Rebecca Yarman, an archaeologist, gets at it really well with regard to a dig that was conducted in the 1990s. She actually studied what could be found in the 5 Points. And she said, the archaeology of domestic trash is no equal for dramatic tales of thieves, prostitutes, and gang wars. The physical remains, however, speak of a determination to maintain respectability, no matter how difficult the circumstances. And I think that's important to remember. I want to talk about the alienation that some native-born New Yorkers could display towards the Irish immigrants in these years. Generally, Irish immigrants who arrived in New York and settled in the 5 Points worked. They were not hard, by no way were they all criminals, but they worked at some of the hardest jobs in the city. Men worked at pick and shovel work. New York was going through a period of growth. They worked digging foundations. They worked putting up buildings. They worked on the docks. These were hard and dangerous occupations. Women tended to work in domestic service. It was a way to have a job that gave you housing and a meal. You were also vulnerable to all sorts of harassment on the part of your employers. You didn't have a lot of time of your own when you were working under somebody's roof, but you had 3 square meals and a warm place to sleep. And that for them was a big improvement. But the work, particularly that men did, was very, very dangerous. Listen to this account from George Templeton Strong in 1857. Strong was a native-born Protestant New Yorker. He kept an extraordinary diary of his life in New York. And He displays a lot of the common beliefs of his time, even though he's an incredible observer of what's going on in the city. He walked past a construction site on 4th Avenue where 2 Irish laborers had been crushed in a cave-in. They were lying white and dead on the ground. Around them were gathered Irish men and women. The men were listless and alert and inert enough, Strong wrote, but not so the women. I suppose they were keening. All together were raising a wild, unearthly cry, half shriek and half song, wailing as a chorus of daylight banshees, grasping their hands and gesticulating passionately. Now and then, some of them would throw herself on one of the corpses or wipe some defilement from the face of the dead man with her apron, slowly and carefully, and then resume her lament. It was an uncanny sound to hear, quite new to me. Our Celtic fellow citizens are as remote from us in temperament and constitution as the Chinese. That sense of difference between native-born Protestant New York and foreign-born Irish Catholic immigrant New York permeated the city's cultural life and its politics. Debates fought out along religious and ethnic lines shaped everything from public school policy to policing to the conduct of elections. In general, Republicans inherited, as you got closer and closer to the Civil War, people who had been in the Whig Party, people who had been know-nothings, who were opposed to immigration altogether. Democrats tended to be more friendly to immigrant interests. Democrats tended to be more welcoming to Catholics and Germans. Republicans were more strongly Protestant in their ethnic and religious makeup. This city is tumultuous. It's the scene of many riots throughout the 1850s, riots against abolitionists, riots over economic upheavals. And as the Civil War approaches, you're left wondering what will happen in this place if something as large as a Civil War breaks out. What happens is the draft riot of 1863. The Civil War finds New York City a city with strong Southern sympathies. New York was the home office of the cotton-producing economy of the South. The slave labor economy of the South found its economic support, its institutional support in New York businesses and merchants and banks. New York shippers also very shrewdly had the cotton moved up the coast from the cotton-producing South and then across the sea to mills in England. It gave New York shippers and merchants a big stake in the economy of slavery. At the same time, although the war brought economic activity to New York City and to the 5 Points, it also brought hardship. There was great inflation during wartime and labor competition between Black and white workers in Lower Manhattan, particularly on the waterfront. When the Emancipation Proclamation comes in 1863, the terms of the war changed. The war is not just to restore the Union, but it's to end slavery. This terrifies some white workers who fear that emancipated Black Americans will come north and compete with them for their jobs. This is somewhat unfair because in many ways, immigrants have been knocking Black people out of jobs in New York City since the 1820s, but it's a very real fear and people are quite willing to act on it. But what makes, I think, the poor of the 5 Points furious in the Civil War is the Union draft policy. Both the Union and the Confederacy had a draft. As the Civil War got bloodier and bloodier, it was harder and harder to find men who were willing to fight. So both North and South resorted to conscription. But in the North, you could buy your way out of your obligation to serve. You could pay a bounty that would get you off the hook, or you could pay someone to substitute for you. And this leads many, many poor New Yorkers to think that the war is a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. When the draft begins in New York City, protests begin very quickly against the draft in 1863. They start in Midtown, but then they spread to other parts of the city. They spread to Lower Manhattan, to the piers, and also areas that we now think of as being part of Midtown. The begin as an attack on the draft. It's fair to say that. They begin as an attack on the wealthy people who the poor of New York City fear are going to find the easy way out of avoiding service on this war. But in a 3-day ordeal, by the end of the first day, the draft riot has become a race riot. African Americans try to defend themselves. The problem is, in most neighborhoods, Black people live in small enclaves, a few buildings, a few blocks, enough to be conspicuous by their presence, but not large enough in numbers to easily defend themselves. Some seek refuge in police stations. Others, there's a memorable account of women in Greenwich Village near what we would today call Minetta Lane, singing psalms to keep their morale up while they boil water on a rooftop and prepare to pour it onto any rioters that try to break into their building. Outside the New York Times in Lower Manhattan, right near today's City Hall, police officers have a huge confrontation with rioters who are trying to trash the Times for its pro-war stance and its support of the Union. There's another great confrontation between rioters and police outside the police headquarters. Eventually, after 3 days, order is restored, but it is a bloody and terrible fight all around the city. Some 119 people died, and New York City's Black population drops 20% afterwards. Many of those people flee to Brooklyn to live in more rural areas where there's a strong Black presence, where they'll feel safer. As peace returns to the city, German Americans, who are the second biggest group to immigrate to New York City before the Civil War, start to really make their presence known in a couple really big ways. One is they've emigrated often with slightly better skills than the Irish, slightly better skills that allow them to make their way better in a growing metropolis, more artisanal skills, less pick and shovel work. So the Germans are starting to get settled, and they also bring something that's striking to New York City. In this time, for native-born Americans, particularly middle-class Americans, men and women were not supposed to socialize together in public. This was a very risky thing. They were certainly not supposed to drink together in public. And yet Germans are very relaxed with men and women socializing together in public and even having a glass of beer in public. Listen to this account of a festival of the Turnverein, a German Republican group in Harlem, Republican with a small r in the sense, not Republican Party, in Harlem in 1856. Here's a reporter recounting the festival that he found, conducted by German immigrants. The pleasures of the festival consisted in enormous straining of enormous muscles on the part of the turners, who did all sorts of physical culture and exercise and gymnastics to build themselves up. They had gymnastic apparatus erected for their accommodation, in listening to very tolerable music from a number of German bands, and to an intermittent thunderstorm of singing from a dozen German sing-song societies, in irregular waltzing on rather rough grass plots, and watching 80 starred policemen and a number of shadows eagerly initiating themselves into all German customs, as they had little else to do. Know what the report is observing. The cops are having beer alongside the Germans, but the Germans are so peaceful, even as they drink beer, that there's no need to be heavy as a police officer. So everybody's getting along really well. People were sitting on the grass and talking to one's friends. German women are not afraid to sit on the grass. This is really notable to the journalist. And last and greatest, in drinking lager beer, the amber nectar flowed in 1,000 streams. Informal German gatherings like this gave way over the next 20 years to big German beer halls, big German theaters, and gardens that people would relax in. If Germans achieved nothing else in New York City in the middle of the 19th century, they loosened everybody up and made them a lot more relaxed. The modern Christmas celebration that we know with Christmas trees and extensive gift giving traces itself to the German immigrants. But listen to this description of the Atlantic Beer Garden in these years. It was on the Bowery in the 1870s. The consumption of the article is only one thing, beer, nightly is tremendous, but there is no drunkenness. The audience is well behaved, and the noise is simply the hearty merriment of a large crowd. There is no disorder, no indecency. The place is thoroughly respectable, and the audience are interested in keeping it so. They come here with their families, spend a social, pleasant evening, meet their friends, hear the news, enjoy the music and beer, and go home refreshed and happy. The Germans are very proud of this resort and would not tolerate the introduction of any feature that would make it an unfit place for their wives or families. Both the Germans and the Irish were active in city politics. Irish Catholics tend to gravitate towards the Democratic Party. Germans who are Catholic, Protestant, and sometimes freethinkers are more broadly spread across the political parties. But the political faction that matters most in New York City these years is the Democratic Party's Tammany Hall organization. Tammany was a democratic political organization founded before the mass Irish immigration by people who are native-born Protestants. But they recognized very quickly in Tammany Hall that the Irish were such a large presence and a friendless presence in New York City that if they took up the interest of Irish immigrants, they could prosper politically. Tweed himself is perhaps one of the single most famous of Tammany Hall leaders, but he himself was not Irish. He was a Protestant of Scottish ancestry. And like most Tammany Hall operatives, started off as a volunteer firefighter and gang member and rose from there to be active in the organization. He was never a mayor, but he worked in the years before and during the Civil War in the state legislature, and he mastered both political structure and the standard Tammany Hall techniques, buying votes, controlling the ballot box, using patronage to reward political allies, and adroit attention to city contracts and opportunities to make a lot of money for people who are politically connected. His monument in many ways in New York City is what we today still call the Tweed Courthouse in Lower Manhattan, right next to City Hall. It was the focus of an enormous amount of kickbacks and double billing, double booking in all sorts of ways. But at the same time that Tweed was doing this, he was also improving the city's infrastructure and this is key, giving the city's poorest, giving the city's Irish immigrants a feeling that he was looking out for their interests and giving them an advocate in City Hall, in the state legislature, in the city council. It's a business, and it's a business of winning elections. And that's what Tammany Hall was about. They were very pragmatic, unlike Protestant reformers who tended to be moralistic and tended to concern themselves very strongly with people's behavior. Tammany Hall tolerated a lot of behaviors as long as you stayed loyal to the organization and supported it when you went to the ballot box. Tweed keeps the peace in this city in a very pragmatic and not morally high-minded way. He presides over a fund established after the draft riot that will buy poor men's obligations to serve. So if a poor man does not want to serve in the Union Army, he can get his bounty paid for in a fund run by Boss Tweed. So he keeps the peace. He also makes it seem to the city's majority that he's got the lid on things. All this comes apart in 1871, and it comes apart from two directions. One is the double billing, the corruption in the creation of the Tweed Courthouse begins to threaten the city's ability to borrow. Businessmen realize that if they can't borrow, then they've got terrible future ahead of them. At the same time, though, there's a riot. As late as 1871, native-born Protestants were celebrating publicly the victories of Protestants over Catholics in Ireland in the long battles between Catholics and Protestants that date to the 17th century there. In 1871, with their numbers slipping, the Orangemen, the members of a Protestant fraternal organization, very powerful in Northern Ireland, and with ebbing power in New York City by 1871, decide to pull off a march. It is protected by the militia. It is hooted at, yelled at, rocks are thrown by Irish Catholics on both sides of the line of march. Somehow a first shot gets fired, then more shots are fired. 60 people die. At this point, Tweed is just not a good bet to the city. He's corrupt and he's going to bankrupt the place, and he can't keep the peace in the streets. And this is what people had relied on him to do. So there's a huge scandal. Tweed himself is tried. He's in and out of jail. He's eventually dying there in 1878. And he looms large in the city's imagination as the epitome of Tammany Hall and political corruption. But I'd say this on behalf of Tammany Hall: although they were corrupt, there were moments when they showed considerable enlightenment in being willing to take on immigrant voters that no one else wanted. And it's probably true that Tammany's greatest product was not Tweed, who had a gargantuan appetite and didn't know how to restrain himself, but Al Smith, who would rise in the Tammany organization in the early 20th century and become governor of New York State. And as governor, introduced all sorts of governmental reforms and projects that would prefigure the New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In many ways, Al Smith, certainly not Boss Tweed, is the inventor of the modern Democratic Party. Tammany would remain a strong force in New York politics until the era of World War II, when ethnic succession and new people coming into politics, particularly Irish and Jews, and the power of the New Deal at the federal level, doing the kind of work that Tammany had once done at the local level, made Tammany obsolete. Here's Mulberry Bend, a bit before 1900. Mulberry Bend is the north end of what you today call Columbus Park. It's the outer edge of what people would have thought of as the 5 Points. Jacob Riis photographed it and put it in his slides when he went around the city inveighing against overcrowded slum housing and the terrible effect that it had on people. This famous photo of a section of Mulberry Bend called Bandit's Roost it's in a spot that is on the east side of Columbus Park. So if you're walking along the east side of Columbus Park, right about the middle of the park, this is the photo that Riis has taken for you. And it makes that area look certainly very, very sinister. Riis himself thought that bad housing was terrible for people. He thought it was not only unhealthy, it brought out criminal and even revolutionary tendencies in them. And he campaigned against it relentlessly, and he finally had his victory in 1897, when those tenements that you saw a moment ago are knocked down and turned into Mulberry Bend Park, designed by Calvin Vaux of Central Park fame. In 1911, Mulberry Bend Park would be renamed Columbus Park in honor of Italian Americans, who were a growing presence in that part of Manhattan by 1911. So in this period, to me, it's fascinating. In one lifetime, this goes from the 5 Points to Mulberry Park, from Irish to Italian, from very rough to very respectable. And it's part of the relentless change that I think is very much part of the history of New York City. This is Columbus Park today. If you walk by there, you'll see that it's got a wide variety of users. At the northern end, you'll find a lot of older Chinese people, and a lot of them are doing singing, playing mahjong and other card games. If you go to the middle of the park, there's a lot of soccer fields. You'll see a lot of young professional types playing soccer. You go a little bit further south to the southern end of the park, right where the 5 Points was, and you'll find a lot of young guys playing basketball. So it gets lots of multiple uses, and it's an important part of the neighborhood today. And in this sense, it's one more reminder of how Lower Manhattan is part of the endless reinvention of New York City through the process of immigration and the endless change in the city's population through the process of immigration. What became of some of these people that I've talked about with you? Well, let's start with Master Juba. He immigrates to England and he starts dancing there, and he's quite a success, but he dies in 1852. So after only 4 years of fame there, he dies under very shady circumstances. Yet tap dancing, shady, not in the sense that that's crooked or corrupt. We just don't know how he died. You know, dancing brought him fame, but it did not give him enduring fortune. At the same time, the tap dancing that he pioneered in Almack's and that other Black and Irish men pioneered on the docks becomes, by the end of the 19th century, one of the great American dance forms that we're known for around the world. What becomes of John Morrissey? Well, he's a Tammany Hall congressman by 1866, but he actually clashes with Tammany Hall because the Tammany Hall politicians, being very pragmatic, will raise taxes when it helps them and cut taxes when it helps them. They'll make expenditures when they want to put lots of Irish American workers on the payroll, but they'll cut those expenditures when they think it's going to get them in trouble. So Tammany and Morrissey wind up clashing with each other because Morrissey thinks that Tammany needs to keep the interests of working class Irish Americans foremost. And he has a big blow up with the mayor. The mayor says, "I'm not even going to speak to you." He tells Morrissey to leave. In a famous episode, I think it's more folklore than fact, is Morrissey returns in a full swallowtail coat, like a long tail tuxedo. And somebody says they met Morrissey on the street as he was striding towards City Hall. And Morrissey says, "Well, I'm going to go pay a call at City Hall because they don't want to speak to sort of rough-heeled Irish American politicians. No Irish need apply now." But dressed in this way, he hoped to get in. Whether he got in or not, whether the incident is even true, it's a sign that Morrissey had his allegiance to the poor working people that he had lived among when he first came to New York City. He also had a great, however, loyalty to gambling and horse racing, and he made that industry flower in Saratoga. He ended his life in the New York State Assembly running for office against a Tammany Hall corporate lawyer. He died a year later and is buried in Troy, New York, where his family first lived when they came to America. Thousands of people showed up at his funeral, and I have heard in pubs in New York City and in Ireland, people singing songs about John Morrissey, the great boxer. Church of the Transfiguration. By the late 19th century, the Irish were a minority in that church. It was becoming much more Italian. If you go there today, look at the plaque to men from the parish who served in World War I. It's overwhelmingly Italian. A few Irishmen, mostly Italian. Today, it's a Chinese American Catholic church. So what's the place of the 5 points in the history of New York City and in American history? Well, a couple things. When we write history shapes how we understand history. Every surge in immigration in US history has been followed by a surge in nativism. The Irish and Germans who came here in the middle of the 19th century met rejection. The Jews and Italians who came at the turn of the 20th century faced it. African Americans who came up from the South, along with Puerto Ricans in the middle years, faced it. So the nativism that we see today is painful, but it's something that has a precedent. The 5 points of history, however, affirm several important points. One is the energy, the work ethic, and the cultural creativity of immigrants. New Yorkers do not have a natural talent for acceptance and inclusion. Immigrants win acceptance and inclusion in every generation. It's not granted to them by beneficent native-born New Yorkers, but achieved often after years of very hard work and even conflict. Certainly, there are and there always have been New Yorkers who've welcomed immigrants to our city, but not all New Yorkers welcome newcomers, and certainly not all Americans share in this attitude. The sociologist Mary Waters, who wrote a great study about the children of immigrants in New York City in 2014, put it this way: whether the tolerance and acceptance of immigrants and their children experienced in New York City will spread to the rest of the country, or the intolerance and exclusion that characterizes other parts of the country will spread to New York City, is an open question. Meanwhile, the race to fix ongoing racial inequality is even more pressing. As immigration increases the number of people facing ongoing racial equality, the verdict on this is still out. But let me leave you with the words of the immigrants themselves who came to New York City in the middle of the 19th century, words that were set down by the British journalist and author Terry Coleman. He wrote a great book called Going to America about the Irish, British, and German immigrants who shipped across the Atlantic in the middle of the 19th century and then walked ashore and made homes on streets not very far from where we're sitting today. When Coleman wrote his book, Passage to Going to America, the Albert Dock in Liverpool, like the South Street Seaport in New York, was somewhat derelict, had a kind of feeling of a left behind place. Today, they're both much transformed, perhaps even gentrified, and dedicated to museum spaces, tourism, and consumer culture. Still, then and now, those streets echo to the voices and footsteps of immigrants who made history there, changing what it meant to be a New Yorker and an American, affirming the idea of both New York and the United States of America as a place where people from all around the world can start new lives and better lives. Coleman wrote, more than 23,000 people came through these places in 10 years in the middle of the last century. Among them were John Ryan, laborer, who crossed the Irish Sea at night on the steamer in a storm, having no shelter except as a man can shelter himself. There was Ellen Keene, aged 4 years and 3 months, of the bark of Syria, who died of fever. There was the schoolboy who wrote to his schoolmaster in London saying he would tell them something about New York, how guns and pistols were very cheap. And the immigrant from Bristol, England, who exclaimed as he sailed into New York Bay, glorious morning, what a fine country. Here at last is America. And Thomas Gary, in Sligo, Ireland, a beggar by profession, but in the United States working to bring his family over and writing home to his wife, saying that he loved her and the children as his life. And if God spared them, they would shortly be together in the lands of promise. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mosaic Broderick. For those of you who haven't had the opportunity of being going to NYU and taking Mosette's classes, I met her actually many years ago. I had a colleague named Julie Eng who was either Mosette's star pupil or her promoter. And she basically said she wouldn't have been an architect if it hadn't been for Mosette. And I said, my God, that's really impressive because that's inspirational. She changed your life. And then I got to know her a little bit, meet her a few times. And I always think about what Julie told me. Julie was also a very good historian, but let's get it from the source today. So I'm looking forward to listening some more to you.
Well, you're very, very effective. Okay, Julie's a very amazing young woman indeed from LA, and she got to stay in New York and get a cat, and has gone on. I think she does boat tours, architectural. Well, that's wonderful. Well, she's very special. Okay, I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about the arts that we've not spoken of in the first lectures here, which were about politics and history. Now I'm going to talk about music and art. No, I'm not actually. I'm going to talk about architecture. I'm going to talk about how the arts come to the United States via American boys at first who go abroad and bring back their ideas of what things should look like in the new America that is becoming wealthier for the first time after the Civil War, after all those components, the Erie Canal, all the things that everybody's been talking about. Suddenly we're beginning to have people with money. And suddenly we're beginning to have people with money who want to do something and express it in their buildings. We don't have a Birkin bag. Nobody has a yacht. Well, actually, a few people do have yachts. This is just the time when they're beginning to do that. But what you did was express your importance by your house, be it a house in the city or a brand new phenomenon, a house in the country. So what I want to do is trace the first generation of Americans who go to Europe to study and bring back culture in a big bag, rather like Santa Claus, carrying all the arts and culture from Europe back to America. actually going across the Atlantic in this time period was kind of a one-way trip. Most people came here and stayed here. The trip across was nasty. It was unpredictable. There were lots of accidents. Lots of boats didn't make it. No GPI, no GPS. There was really kind of a dangerous thing to do. And so the idea of going across to imbibe European culture was something of a challenge that begins to take place really just after the Civil War. We're looking here at a group of young men who will form an architectural association, the first big architectural firm in the United States. It remains one of the biggest architectural firms in history of the United States, and that is the firm McKim, Eden White, who did something like 1,000 buildings in the time of their work. They didn't do it alone, of course. They worked with a lot of young men, which I'll show you in a minute. Okay, so everything is new to Charles Follen McKim, who you see here as a star baseball player in his class at Harvard. McKim wasn't much of a student. In fact, he really didn't do well in his first year at Harvard, but he was a great baseball player. And so the college allows him to stay beyond the end of his first year, which he doesn't go back. He doesn't go back to the college. But what they let him do is stay on anyway, so he can win an award for the Harvard baseball team, which you see him doing here. He's the young man standing with the hair parted. It's the last known picture of McKim with hair. And what he's going to do is travel across the Atlantic. And what he was going to do there wasn't too clear. He didn't make it in school. The new field at that point was mining engineering. He thought about that, but somehow just before he left, he changed his mind and decided he was going to try to learn about architecture. Unlike his partner Stanford White, unlike some other young men of the era, he didn't sketch, he didn't draw, he wasn't somebody who was naturally artistic as a young person. He just saw this as a good opportunity for a young man to make a career in newly rich becoming America. And so what he does is go across and study. Briefly, doesn't do very well at the École either, but he comes back and starts a little firm with some help from his father. Abolition is a topic you all have heard about today. McKim's father was one of the major figures in abolition, so his father had very good connections. He was also a Presbyterian minister in his early days. So between his connections, he was able to get McKim some early jobs for something brand new: country houses, seaside houses, summer houses. Nobody did that. What did you do in New York City? What did you do if you lived here before the Civil War in the summer? A few people went off to Staten Island. There was a little bit of summer homes in Staten Island, but not very much. A few people went up the Hudson where the black fly makes that a little bit hard to do. After the Civil War, the coasts call in the newly well-off. Long Branch, New Jersey, Elberon, New Jersey. The Rockaways, interestingly enough. Newport, a place that had a different history, but now is becoming a summer home environment. And several other places along the way. It begins very slowly in Southampton, which is very specifically Catholic Southampton. So it doesn't thrive until Long Branch, New Jersey slides. So what we see, though, is the first generation of summer homes. And they were summer homes only. And that's one of the main reasons they don't exist anymore, because they were built only to be used for a few months in the summer. You can't convert them very easily into. So all of these first American generation of doing something ourselves, our first time when we build houses for ourselves with our own design that people like McKim bring back from Europe, and they're gone. The only place that really has, Long Branch, New Jersey, particularly tore down every single one. It was one of the head offices, and they really did a terrible job. There's some a little bit in Newport, but very, very little. So we ruined our first venture. Now, McKim, to do these, set up an office, and this is a picture of the McKim office right here, oddly enough, 55 Broadway. And what we see is how sort of simple and primitive, and it's a place where I guess they smoked cigarettes and hung over their desks doing drawings and all that sort of thing. So this is the first sort of beginnings of a good-sized architectural office that will grow. The office will grow during the years, and McKim will acquire a partner. This is his partner, William Rutherford Mead, a man who actually is the only one of the firm who ever went to college and succeeded in finishing it. And what you're seeing is the person who was in the middle of the firm. We're going to see Stanford White in a few minutes, but McKim and Mead do a couple of small houses for private clients their middle-class families could provide. And they moved themselves and situated themselves in New York City, which looked like this at the time. New York City was just emerging from the great Greek revival houses and the centricity of the society of New York City around Washington Square, but it has moved by now uptown. We'll see that in a minute. And what did they do for the city of the day? They built themselves summer houses. And here are some of the summer houses. These ones are in New Jersey. As I was saying to you, they don't exist anymore, but they were wonderful, big, sociable plazas. This is kind of a lot like Teddy Roosevelt. You know, you rode your horse and you fished and you worried about how to get something to grow because they had to clean the property in order to build these simple wooden buildings, but they still had to clean the property. So you worried about how to get some growth, some trees, some plants to get something to grow there so it didn't look so barren. And so that's what people did. It wasn't particularly pretentious at this point. This is my favorite of the houses. It has literally a driveway running through it. Why? And this was another Elberon house. Why? They have a lot of big porches. Why? Because it's hot. Don't have air conditioning. So you sleep on the porches. You go out on the porches. You don't spend much time in the house. House is hot. See that driveway? What in the world does that need? Well, the cooking facilities are on the small side of the house, separated by the driveway, so that the heat of cooking doesn't make the heat inside for those who are eating or sleeping. And what you're seeing is the study of where Americans were going at this time as they began to travel in safer boats, therefore consider going to Europe, even if they weren't going to study as McKim and other young soon-to-be professionals would do. Where did rich people, newly rich American industrialists go by the late 1870s, early 1880s? Northern France. They went to Normandy. Why? Because that is where the French industrialists were. So they went and they followed them, and they came back with a lot of the forms from the simple Norman buildings that were at that point pretty isolated in the empty area that is cool and wet in June. I don't know why they went there, but they haven't discovered, the French have not discovered southern France. So what we see is the influence of Normandy on the early house. Oh, sorry, I'm going to do it here. On the early houses that McKim does. And then what about the city? The city isn't ready for them. The city at this point is a city of builders. There are no true architects here until the 1850s, early 1860s. There's almost nobody who has learned the profession other than hands-on job work. Most of the so-called architects who did these buildings in the city, which are the runs of brownstones that are coursing their way up Fifth Avenue from Washington Square, and by the time McKim comes back, are in the 30s and 40s. And what do the brownstone builders, what do the brownstone houses have in common? That they're all built by builders. Almost all of them are done by commercial builders who are often building speculators, who are often the people who put up the money to build the buildings, and everybody wants to look the same. Everybody wants the same brownstone house. Everybody wants the same features in the house. If your friend has just gone to Paris to outfit their brownstone, and they've got these really neat chandeliers and candelabras from a certain shop in Paris, everybody wants it. So it's a period of conformity. It's a period of everybody wanting to do the same thing. And it's a period of time when everybody looks alike. And what the new architects who are coming in and McKim, Mead, and White are going to do is give them a different vocabulary. It's going to change the game. Instead of conformity, we're going to find that well-to-do people want to show off as they become richer and richer by building houses that are more and more elaborate, more and more unusual, more and more characteristic of the fame of the people. This is a wonderful house that was on 72nd Street and Madison Avenue for the Tiffany family. Louis Comfort Tiffany at the top, his sister below, and his father in the ground floor. A wonderful house that doesn't look at all like a brownstone. It's not even, it was several kinds of stone in it, but none of them brown. And what you're looking at is a sort of chateau-esque big building that's the equivalent of 3 or 4 brownstone plots. If the brownstone plot was 25 feet across, this is about 4 of them into the Tiffany private family apartment house. This is unusual. I don't know of any other such building where the family each takes a floor, which sort of breaks the building up into their own units, but it's only for the family. It's not for strangers. Everybody is still living in row house. Row house for well-to-do people, for middle-class people is still absolutely important. You cannot really be part of a continually evolving and upwardly moving society at this point if you don't live in a row house. We're also beginning to see the change in interiors as the wanting to do everything your neighbor does and have exactly the same house that everybody has in your block begins to change. And we begin to see people wanting to have their own interiors and wanting to make them more, if they use the word in this time period, artistic. And so houses are beginning to have individual character. And McKim, Mead and White, or McKim and Mead go into a little bit of a different mode. This is a row house they did, a double row house. You can see it right here. It isn't brownstone. It's stone base, brick above. And it is anything but the usual Renaissance-inspired brownstone that line the streets and surrounds the houses. They're still getting country jobs. This is the wonderful country summer house jobs. This is the wonderful Narragansett Pier, a pier McKim built very early after his sojourn in France. He comes back, builds this. This is for people who haven't quite made it to Newport. If you go do a trial, you rent a house in Newport, and you do a trial, and if you don't quite make it, if they don't kind of accept you, if you don't get dinner invitations, you go 10 blocks away and you go to Narragansett. And this is Narragansett. And what you've got is a big Louis Sherry. Anybody old enough to remember Louis Sherry? This was Louis Sherry's big ice cream place on the right. And McKim built this wonderful, and this is extant. Although they had a little hurricane damage in the early 20th century, it's still there. But McKim, when he finished it, again, it's Normandy. And what McKim did, it's the first time, when they go to Normandy, it's the first time Americans and these architect trainees ever saw old buildings. They never saw anything old because everything here was new. Everything was something we were just building, something modest. And they went abroad and they saw these old buildings, some of them built at different periods over time. And so McKim, when he does this, which is meant to look like it's been built over time, what he does when they're ready for the opening day, he suddenly demands a ladder and a hammer. And they look at him like he's crazy, but produce the ladder and the hammer. And he goes up to the slate shingles at the roof of this house, at the roof of this pier rather, and he pulls them out so that they had a slight look as if they were there before and they were damaged over time. What happens to this rather ingenious American era? It gets Italianated. The wonderful world of travel is now really possible in the 1880s. And more people are beginning to go, including the young man who is the source of the grandeur of McKim, Mead and White, Joseph M. Wells. We always think that architects do it all themselves. Architectural offices, as some of you may know, consists of the head of the offices who are often glad hands. They go to the country club, they go to the bars, they go to the parties, and somebody in the office does the real work. This is a young man, a young doomed man who didn't live very long. But it was as his few years at McKim, Mead and White took place that McKim, Mead and White became good architects. And that's because he did it. What Joseph Wells would do is get a problem. They're building a house, the proportions, the partners, McKim and Mead, really weren't very good at it. And what he would do when he'd see the drawings there, the concept for the house, he'd get really depressed. He said, this just doesn't work. And so he'd go over to 55 Broadway to a big window, and he'd open the window, and he had a chenille monkey, a children's chenille monkey. And he dangled it down out the 5th floor. It didn't hurt anybody. He dangled the monkey for a day, 2 days. And then suddenly he got the solution. Suddenly he knew what he could do to pull the design they just made that wasn't very good together to get it to balance, to get it to work. And he'd run back to his desk and create the buildings that made McKim, Mead and White famous. Just skimmed by this one. He goes to Italy, and somehow it's like a bright light that shows he loved Normandy. He loved the Norman English work. and he goes to Italy and throws it over. He had known Italian Renaissance palaces from book plates, but now he saw them. And he becomes the master of the early phase of the 1880s when New York City and America embrace Italian palace architecture for the newly rich. This is a drawing by Wells, but we're going to see it come home in many of the buildings they do, such as the so-called Villard houses, now the Lotta Hotel right behind St. Patrick's, and many of the buildings we look at, which are balanced in good proportion. They show a person who's been to Italy's understanding of the Renaissance. If you go right down here, very near you all, there's something at Hanover Square, which used to be called India House. I don't know, is it still called India House? I think it's a really wonderful building. That's done by Richard Carman, a man from builder from Upper Manhattan, from what used to be Carmansville, up in the 130s area. He never went anywhere. We didn't have photographs. So Alinari, as a photographer of major buildings, only becomes a commercial building in 1871. So when he builds India House in 1853, he's just doing it from woodcuts and book plates, and he has no idea what he's doing. And I always say it looks in that Italian palace as if the windows and the doors are in a subway car at rush hour. Everything's too close. The proportions are off. It's wonderful. Mind you, it's one of my favorite buildings, but it doesn't show sophistication of the real thing. Now we've got people going to Italy. Now by the 1880s, 40 years later, they can come back and do something that's accurate and something that grows. This is the University Club, as you all may recognize, a building in the Italian Renaissance style. For anybody who had any 5 minutes at any teaching university beyond high school in its day, it is a building of an interpreted Renaissance. By the 1890s, McKim is doing things that are a little more inventive. This is McKim. And as Corbusier said when he came to New York on his first trip here, I like the Renaissance, meaning this building specifically, I like the Renaissance better in New York than I do in Italy. And we begin to see the results of this all within the 30 years of the lifetime of the partners. They get all the big jobs. Columbia campus, NYU's Uptown campus, Penn Station, a plan for Grand Central Station that Stanford White didn't get to build. They get the big jobs everywhere. McKim is redoing the White House. We've come so far afield that when McKim looks at the work of the 1870s in the White House for Teddy Roosevelt, who's asking him to redo it, and he sees the wonderful Tiffany screen that he would have happily put in there in the late 1870s, and Roosevelt says, what am I supposed to do with this screen? And he says, trash it. We have so changed in 30 years. We are rich, we take ourselves seriously, and we think that we can present ourselves on the world stage as a nation now, the equal of the old established nations of Europe. And that's exactly what McKim, Eden, White are going to do here. We see them with something new they pick up. We're out at Box Hill in Stanford White's famous house, still there, being at the moment lovingly restored by his family, his descendants. They've come up with something new that they bring back that from Pau in France. They pronounce it, or they spell it Goff. We will realize they mean golf. So it is a brand new sport of the late 1880s, a brand new idea that comes here. And like anything that comes from Europe, we got to take it on. We got to do it better than anybody else. So here we see a little golf course that Stanford White is building on his property, and his partners smoking cigars is probably not the right thing to do. But there they are. And here's my favorite picture of the three of them as mature men. By now they're kind of ruling the world. They're doing Washington, the plan of DC. They're, things have just gone to this amazing position of world leaders. In fact, McKim is called to get the RIBA gold, the Royal British Institute of Architects gold medal. We've really become, in the lifetime of this one man, a country that is on a par with the best that can be done abroad. And here we have them pretending to look at a plan. Actually, they were always kind of giving that plan over to young men in the office. They train the entire next generation of architects, rather. Most of the major architects who come out after this come out from McKim White's office from training there. In fact, Europeans kept coming here. They come to the McKim White office and beg to work free for 6 months in the office. And Mead turns them down, by the way. Bannister Fletcher, if anybody, the great architect, Bannister Fletcher comes over and asks to work, and Mead says, bye. No interest. But the British come by to learn from us because we're building these new tall buildings. They don't actually, but we're building skyscrapers, we're building corporate buildings. And so the flow from Europe to us changes, and we begin to see our influence going to Europe. And this culminates perhaps with the railroad station that was the greatest railroad station we ever had in New York City, which tragically, as many, it's just a little, I'm old, it's just a little before my time, but this is Penn Station, which we never should have torn down. And if any of you follow Mr. Turvey, Samuel Turvey, with his Rethink Penn Station, one of the designs, the through rail is something that's coming up. Sounds a very good idea, but they also say you could rebuild the main part of Penn Station today because we've got the plans, we've got the drawings, and what we could do is do it with machines. It was done with Italians. It was done with the people who know what they're doing in stone are Italians. And we brought over the buildings. People would say, I've got 600 Italians working on the Vanderbilt Palace. That's probably not true. But we brought over people who knew what the heck they were doing with stone, and then we trashed it. And there are lots of stories of people who tear down these buildings crying because they know what the workmen did 60 years earlier when they created the buildings that they're being asked to trash. So we see this happening in America, of course, as you all know, went through a festival of trashing it ourselves. This is one of the figures from the old Penn Station. Now, I guess a lot of it seems to be the bottom of the Jersey Meadows. What is it called? The Sports Center of New Jersey there. What? Yeah, thank you. Meadowlands. So that's where a lot of the stonework went. So it's a real tragedy. One surviving bit of McKim at his best, and America at his best of this buying up and bringing back all of Europe is this. This is the Morgan Library. Morgan built it. I'm sorry, McKim built it, Morgan filled it. You know, he bought so much art, so many books, so many manuscripts, so many drawings, so many prints that he didn't die with really any money. He died with masses of art, which he distributed. But this is his private library, as you all know, recently redone. And it is the culmination of Europe's going to take us seriously. Yeah, we are equal now, and we're building as well as anybody in any other nation can. We're America, and we're part of the real first world. Thank you.
That's me. You might not recognize me because I'm not wearing glasses. It's a passport photo, and you can't wear glasses, and that's ridiculous. Anyway, before I start, I have a confession to make. It concerns my story about this house, the former home of Mr. and Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish at 25 East 78th Street. Somebody is nodding her head. The architect Stanford White of McKim White was asked to design it, and I wrote that Stanford White was seldom happy. Is it working? Was seldom happy if he had to deal with rich men's wives, whose concerns were ordinarily mundane matters, such as ample closet space or a playroom for the children, as Mosette Broderick reminds us. Her primary concern was to have a gracious setting for parties. Are we on? So as Mrs. Fish was hardly interested in anything as mundane as utility, her primary concern was to have gracious setting for parties, for entertaining, and that was right up Stanford White's alley. And here's my confession. I did both the index and the bibliography for the book, and Mosette Broderick's name is found in neither,
Oh, well, that's lucky.
which means that her wonderful book, Triumvirate, McKinley and White, is not mentioned. Mea culpa, mea culpa. If you forgive me, I'll continue. All right, so this is the cover of Scoundrels, and the photo shows the literal city, while the yellowed scruffy title area provides a hint of the other side of all the GILT gilt, the GUILT gilt. You see the 6th Avenue L, which had a station at 18th Street, right in front of a building with a tall tower topped by a gilded dome. That's the Seal Cooper department store. Only the base of the tower remains, but the building does. And I'll be talking about the store because it synthesized several leitmotifs of the book. Here's how I begin the introduction. The Tammany Hall politician, George Washington Plunkett, famously said, "I seen my opportunities and I took them." Like the state senator, the players in this book also saw their opportunities, and they too took them, or at least they tried. The average New Yorker went about his daily life playing by the rules of the game in the 1890s. Some might have cheated a little, but they were only scalawags. Other individuals, along with the managements of some businesses and political organizations, played by totally different rules, successfully gaming the system to their advantage, to the disadvantage of countless others. And then there were the scrappers who fought to change the system, to improve it and make things better. And every so often they succeeded. The average New Yorker, however, could have cared less, with no interest in rocking society's boat or the ship of state. The 1890s was the tail end of the Gilded Age. It was not a golden age, it was gilded, a veneer. The decade is specifically called the Gay 90s, which is a bit of a misnomer. There was a high degree of gaiety, all right, but it was generally reserved for the top 10 percenters. If you were working stiff or worse, a common working stiffette, life was not so gay. With that said, I'm going to start this presentation by reading the first line or paragraph of some of the stories that make up the chapters. And sometimes I tell some more just so you can get a hint of some of the developments. I begin each chapter with a photo of a building that still stands and is relevant to the story to create a physical link between the city of today and the city of the 90s. Here's La Creme de la Creme. It's on Delmonico's on Beaver Street, just up the block. A machine is a machine. A restaurant is a machine for dining. And the restaurants flying the Delmonico colors in the 1890s were hands down the best oiled and smoothest operating machines for fine dining in New York City. Delmonico's is royalty, and they catered to royalty. Royalty by blood, such as the Duke of Marlborough, and royalty by achievement, such as Sarah Bernhardt, along with just ordinary folks who had more money. And how would Delmonico's earn a spot in this book? Well, their willingness to meet the desires of customers developed into a legal problem. Charles Ranhover, a chef at Delmonico's, had a cookbook published in 1893, and this was no ordinary cookbook. The first 14 words spelled it out. The Epicurean, a complete treatise of analytical and political and practical studies of the culinary art. At 1,183 pages, the recipes in this Franco-American culinary encyclopedia were designed for the hautest of haute cuisine chefs. One of the things that Ranhofer stressed is that seasonal offerings had to be considered. When certain game was in season, for instance, and Ranhofer had page after page of tables of supplies, each page with 12 columns, one for each month of the year. And what do you see down at the bottom of this page? For game, woodcock. And what do you suppose Delmonico served several days in June? You got it, woodcock. And Delmonico's was taken to court. The lawyers for the defense said, woodcock? Poppycock. The problem for the litigants was the district attorney who was to prosecute the case, Delancey Nichol, an upper-class good old boy. Nichol did not see to calendaring the case until March 1893, by which time Charles Chris Delmonico had as good as conceded the case. Delmonico declared that it was his duty as a restaurateur and host to serve his customers whatever they desired, in season or out. He had always done so, he would continue to do so, and he might well have added, damn the consequences. The defendant was ultimately encouraged to plead guilty, pay the fine, and be done with it. And here comes another juicy part. By December 1893, District Attorney Nichol had decided to retire, and 230 of the city's leaders gathered to honor him at a banquet. The head of the City Bar Association declared that during Delancey Nichol's service, there had never been a whisper that any man in the city was powerful enough to command Nichol or cunning enough to influence him against his convictions. And the room rang with an endorsement of the tribute. The space just happened to be the main dining room of Delmonico's, and it just went to show the power of the Delmonico name. Not only might Charlie Delmonico have been commanding enough to influence Nichol to stall on the Woodcock case, but Delmonico was cunning enough to arrange to host the banquet honoring the man who theoretically had been the restaurant's legal comeuppance. This is called a tower above everything else, the Park Row building at 15 Park Row. If bigger was already deemed better by the 1890s, taller was beginning to be considered better still. By the time the Park Row building opened in February 1899, there were already 6 buildings in the city that were taller than 300 feet. The 32-story Park Row building would top them all, rising 391 feet to the tips of its twin cupolas. The building would take the title of world's tallest and crown itself. This story relates some of the hoops that Tammany Hall politicians had the developers jump through to get the building built. The building department's usual modus operandi was simple and direct. You can proceed with your plans as they are in exchange for some cash. It was as simple as direct. Unless, of course, you had your own political clout. This building got built because of some political clout. This is entitled No School for Scandal. This is formerly the New York Times building. Adolph S. Ox, the Chattanooga newspaper man who had become the publisher of the New York Times by 1896, clearly liked his office right where it was, right in the middle of the concentration of industry along Park Row that was dubbed Printing House Square. The Times had 4 offices abroad, plus one in Washington, D.C., one in Brooklyn, and one in Manhattan at 1227 Broadway. The masthead gave no address for the newspaper's headquarters. It simply said Printing House Square. As I later say, the Times was already respected as an arbiter of the news, but Ox wanted some publicity, and he chose the columns in the Times in which to do it. He held a contest to replace the slogan that he had coined, all the news that's fit to print. Sound familiar? He had already confessed to a confidant that he had never really wanted to change the slogan. It was just a publicity ruse. Here's a building that some of you might recognize. This chapter is entitled Here Today, Almost Gone Yesterday. And we're talking about City Hall. Novelty was all the rage in the late 19th century. And by the late 1880s, the spirit of tearing down and building up was already deeply rooted in the city's psyche. Everything was fair game in the demolition derby, and the glint in the wrecker's eye was falling upon the venerable City Hall. Yes, the Tammany politicians thought they saw their opportunities in erecting a new municipal building on the site. But some scrappers began a proto-preservation movement, and Tammany's plan fizzled. Here's a bit on what the scrappers did. The Tribune interviewed 9 former mayors in March 1894, and 7 strongly endorsed the idea that City Hall should be preserved on its original site and perform its original function. Its historical associations and the high quality of its design demanded nothing less, they said. High quality of design and historical associations are the essence of landmark legislation. And it was Andrew Haswell Green who, with Sons of the American Revolution, working as part of the deal, was in large part responsible for starting the preservation movement. Soon, delegation after delegation from various local organizations was traipsing up to Albany to press the case. In the spring of 1894, the Democratic governor signed the bill preserving City Hall. In terms of landmark preservation, it was a first in New York City, a fact that generally goes unheralded. This chapter is entitled A Cleaner New York Was Up to Him, and the building we're looking at is the former A.T. Stewart Marble Store, and it was then, part of it was being rented by the Excise Commissioner's Office. The news that greeted Colonel George E. Waring on his 3rd day on the job as the city's superintendent of street cleaning could hardly have been worse. Waring had been hired by the newly elected reform mayor, William L. Strong, to clean up the city's notoriously dirty streets. And Waring's tour of duty did not begin until January 15, 1895. Upon the promulgation of a report from the Excise Commissioner's Office, Waring realized that before he could start making any progress on his real goal, he had some internal house cleaning to do. He had to clean up the street cleaning department. According to the New York Times, the sanitation workers were already sullied. They towed the Tammany line, and under Tammany, they had only 3 things to do. One was to vote according to the wishes of the man who secured him his appointment. 2, make his regular contribution to Tammany. And 3, keep his streets clean. If he failed in 1 and 2, he was dismissed for failing in 3. If he took care of 1 and 2, he could neglect 3 with impunity. The recently unearthed expose plumbed new depths, and it's a good thing that Colonel Waring was a scrapper. Too bad, however, that with the new administration in City Hall in 1898, do I need to say Tammany was back? Waring's good work was undone. This is a tenement on at 163 Mott Street. That's the former home of the Barbella family. And the title of this chapter is That Name Will Never Be the Same. Maria. For Tony, the fictional hero of West Side Story, he would never stop saying Maria. For Domenico Cataldo, however, the real-life villain in this Lower East Side story, his Maria would stop him from saying anything ever again. She slit his throat with his own razor. to cite another Broadway musical, this one set in Chicago. He had it coming. Some legal legerdemain got Maria off, but not before some of society's more questionable standards came into play. This chapter is called "It Was a Powerhouse." It's the Cable Building, 611 Broadway, another McKim and Mike production. And it is axiomatic the population follows transportation. And in the 1890s, cable cars were introduced, and the Metropolitan Cable Car Company promised the municipality that it would give continuous journeys from one end of the city to the other without any change of cars. The Battery at the southern tip of the island was one end of the city, and the company's definition of the other end served its purposes admirably. It was 59th Street at Central Park, which translated into the cable cars operating in the most densely developed sections of the city, ignoring the developing neighborhoods north of 59th. Tammany agreed to go along with the idea that the cable car should operate where the money was. It was to their mutual benefit. And here's a building you might know, because it's now Jefferson Market Library. And in those days, it was the Jefferson Market Courthouse. And this chapter is entitled "Not Even a Glimpse of Stocking." A crowd the likes of which had never before seen at the Jefferson Market Courthouse gathered in front of the courthouse on Saturday morning, March 23rd, 1895. The Jefferson Court was a police court, the lowest court in the pecking order of justice. And although police courts could temporarily hold prisoners accused of major crimes, Harry K. Thaw, who shot Stanford White, spent the night there. But the usual trials were for minor offenses. Shoplifting and drunk and disorderly charges hardly draw a crowd. The attraction that morning was a hearing before a judge on a scintillating variation on the tableau vivant, or living picture. The normal tableau vivant might have had society leaders recreating famous works of art in period costume for the pleasure of their peers. The productions were all very proper, all very chaste, and all very clothed. The variation on the tableau vivant that was introduced at the Casino Theater, however, was deemed a bit too vivant, and certainly a bit too pictorially graphic. Except for a covering of bronze powder that adhered to the bodies of the models over a layer of oil, the models were described as being nude. I end this chapter by invoking the tune of the James Bond movie, Goldfinger. This is Great Church on Broadway at 10th, 808 Broadway, and this chapter is entitled "To Have and to Bank On." The 1890s witnessed one American heiress after another being auctioned off to titled but impecunious bidders, although impecunious is a somewhat relative term. In 1893, William IV, Earl of Craven, married Cornelia Martin, and it's hard to believe that the Earl could really have been broke. Craven's annual income was reportedly about $400,000 a year. And at 1895 dollars is worth about 32 today. So you do the math. It was a lot of money. But he found it difficult to maintain his lifestyle on it, paying staff to maintain his family estate and stables, plus a townhouse on London's Berkeley Square, all while leading the good life took money. And who knew how much he might get with an American bride? Cornelia Martin's parents had it, and to marry off their daughter to a titled Englishman and become in-laws of British nobility, they were willing to part with some of it. By most accounts, $1 million in cash. The church they chose as the setting for the nuptials was Grace. Whether the Martins were regular church goers is up for grabs, since an oversight had to be reconciled before the church would agree to marry the young, she was only 16, Cornelia. She had to be confirmed. This is originally the Seal Cooper department store. You saw the building with a tower with a gilded top. And this chapter is entitled Shop Talk. New York's Seal Cooper store opened with a bang on the evening of September 12th, 1896. The store held what management dubbed a dress rehearsal, and nearly 150,000 of the curious showed up to inspect the building. What had attracted so many people to the store's dry run was all the hoopla that had been in the newspapers, with one major story after another regaling readers with every aspect of the store. The mere fact that the New York Times had begun one story by stating flat out that the new Seal Cooper would be the largest and finest building ever erected in New York City for the retail trade. That was just the kind of press that would have made any publicist proud. Keep going to the next, if you would. Thank you. One of the most highly touted attractions of Seal Cooper was the fountain, which threw 4 jets of water around a statue that stood on a marble pedestal in the middle of an ornamental pool, with electric lights changing the tint of the spray. This statue wasn't just any old statue. It was a 13-foot-high copy of Daniel Chester French's 65-foot-high statue of the Republic that had graced the Court of Honor at Chicago's Columbian Exposition, a national statue that at the time was perhaps second in fame only to the Statue of Liberty. Only about 35,000 made it through the doors for the dress rehearsal. The 115,000 who were turned away were kept quietly in line by the New York City Police Department. Wise in the ways of doing the correct thing politically, the store's management officially thanked the police department for the way it had handled the crowd. Management handed off a $250 check as a slight expression of their esteem to the Policemen's Benefit Association for the benefit of retired and disabled members. Seal Cooper is a great example of the 90s, if only because it manifested so many of the elements of the decade. No sick leave for its employees, no retirement benefits, no paid vacation, working hours that averaged about 60 hours a week, plus a double standard in pay. The so-called shop girls got about half as much as their male counterparts. The standards for keeping a job were rigid, and it's not as if the employees had not been forewarned. The standards were printed, there for all to read. Under things not to do, many of the store's basic 12 commandments, their thou shalt nots, might have resulted in fines or termination if the worker transgressed. Although the specifics were not spelled out, many of the commandments seem to have been aimed specifically at the store's female employees. No gossiping, no flirting, etc. For the record, if you look at that image on the screen now, the Probst Construction Company got Seal Cooper's address seriously wrong. 165th Avenue versus 626th. How are we fixed for time? Quitting time?
If you'd like to do a couple of
You want
slides.
another one? This chapter is called Separate and Second Class, and it was originally the Methodist Book Concern, 155th Avenue. It might sound like the beginning of an old chestnut, but it was no joke. 2 clergymen and a colleague walk into a restaurant. They take a table and start ordering lunch. only to be told by the waiter that he could not take their order. When asked why, the waiter replied that it was against the rules of the house to serve colored men, and one of the clergymen just happened to be black. The head waiter, with a shrug, politely declined to intervene, and the proprietor told the threesome to leave. The idea that this took place in a restaurant near Herald Square in 1893 seems inconceivable, but that's where and when it occurred. The year was 25 years after the 14th Amendment had guaranteed equal protection under the law to all citizens, and 18 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1875 had guaranteed equal access to public accommodations to all citizens. One of the heroes of this chapter is Ida B. Wells. At a time when Black women generally had two strikes against them, their gender and their race, Ida B. Wells was leading the charge for equality on several fronts. In fact, in one aspect, she was the unheralded Rosa Parks of her day. This is formerly the saloon of Benjamin W. Singer at 1149 Broadway, and it's entitled No Free Lunch. It is a truth universally acknowledged that drinking on an empty stomach is inadvisable, something that the upstate Republican Senator John Raines took to heart. Never a publicly avowed prohibitionist, Raines nevertheless saw that a state law was enacted in 1896 that, among other things, mandated that if you wanted to have a drink at a bar, it couldn't simply be a drink, or even a drink accompanied by some peanuts or a snack. It had to be accompanied by something more substantial. It had to be accompanied by a meal. The tradition of saloons offering what passed as a free lunch in exchange for a customer ordering a beer would be a thing of the past. The free lunch was not deemed a meal. The law was passed on April 1st. Yes, April Fool's Day. Enough said. The consequences of the Raines Act are another microcosm of the period and the way certain laws could become marvelously twisted by the truly inventive. My last sentence in the chapter is, would that the framers of the Volstead Act had listened. Do you know about Raines Law hotels? Hotels could serve liquor on Sundays in their dining rooms, not in the bars, but in the dining rooms. So how many barmen said, hey, what's the definition of a hotel? It's got to be open 24 hours a day. It has to serve meals, and it has to have a minimum of 10 rooms. So the barman said, hey, we'll carve up some rooms in the back. If we need to, we'll rent some space upstairs in the tenement, and we'll go into the hotel business. So they were serving booze on Sundays. This is formerly the Holland House Hotel, and this chapter is entitled The Social Comedy. Poor Howard Gould. When his father, Jay Gould, died in 1892, leaving all of his approximately $60+ million, a $60 million estate evenly divided among his 6 children, the will had only one string attached, and that string was in Cupid's bow. If a majority of the siblings did not approve of a proposed union, they could put a damper on the plans. The wayward siblings' share in the estate could be reduced by 1/2. An alert would sound for gold diggers in certain professions, with thespians sounding an alert an octave or 2 higher. And then along came the actress Catherine Clemens. She became the love interest in Howard Gould's life, and he had a living in style in the city's grandest hotel in the early 1890s, the Holland House. And this chapter is entitled Comstockery Be Darned. This is formerly the home of the Reverend Dr. and Mrs. Charles Parkhurst. When you consider how a minister's life is spent, You might imagine croquet or lawn tennis or some other courtly game. The minister of the Madison Square Presbyterian Church, the Reverend Dr. Charles Parkhurst, was different. In his younger days, he liked to go mountaineering, and the Catskills would not satisfy him. He would go to Europe and climb the Alps. He climbed the Matterhorn in 1892 at age 50. Parkhurst was still a sportsman at heart, and he had, in 1892 at age 50, Parkhurst was still a sportsman at heart, and he had metaphorically come to like fishing. And what did he go fishing for? Not for porgies. He went for the sharks. He did not consider himself a reformer, but he was grouped with the likes of Anthony Comstock. And Parkhurst wrote a story for the Times in the 1930s in which he summed up the futility of Anthony Comstock's idea of reform. You cannot legislate the human race into heaven, he said. Are we over?
We're over, but is there a highlight in the last couple of slides you want to?
Oh, I mean, let's end with Comstockery. So, okay. As they say at the end of Looney Tunes, that's all, folks.
All right, does anybody have any questions? Okay. Then I think you should repair to the Flim Flam, the American House, well, somewhere, and enjoy the evening. Thank you so much for coming, and come and see us again tomorrow. We're going to be at noon at the Thompson Warehouse, where we're going to do infrastructure in the 1900s.